Atlantis, the mysterious hidden world. Somewhere beneath the rolling waves of an ancient ocean, buried under millennia of silence, sediment, and mystery, there may lie the remains of the most extraordinary civilization humanity has ever known or ever imagined. A civilization so advanced, so powerful, so magnificent that its very name has echoed across nearly 2,500 years of human history. A single word that conjures images of golden temples, impossible engineering, godlike kings, and a cataclysm so total, so absolute that an entire continent was swallowed by the sea in a single night and a single day. That word is Atlantis. It is perhaps the greatest unsolved mystery in all of human history, a riddle wrapped in philosophy, geology, mythology, and the deepest longings of the human spirit. Was Atlantis real? Was it a parable? Was it a memory of something genuinely lost, a great civilization that flourished and fell before recorded history even began? Or was it the invention of one of history's greatest minds, a fictional device designed to teach a moral lesson about the dangers of hubris and the wrath of the gods? For over 2,300 years, scholars, explorers, mystics, scientists, archaeologists, and dreamers have tried to answer that question. They have searched in the Atlantic Ocean, the Mediterranean Sea, the coasts of Africa, the islands of the Caribbean, the frozen reaches of Antarctica, the highlands of South America, and the river deltas of Southeast Asia. They have dived to the ocean floor, scanned the seabed with sonar, studied ancient texts in dead languages, and analyzed geological records stretching back tens of thousands of years. And still, Atlantis remains hidden. Tonight, we embark on the most comprehensive journey ever undertaken into this mystery. We will trace the story from its very first utterance in ancient Athens, through centuries of interpretation and speculation, across oceans and continents, deep into the earth and deeper still into the human imagination. We will examine every major theory, weigh the evidence, confront the skeptics, and follow the trail wherever it leads, even if it leads to places we never expected. This is the story of Atlantis, the mysterious hidden world. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it. And be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. Chapter 1, The Voice of Plato. To understand Atlantis, we must begin where the story itself begins, not in some lost ruin beneath the sea, not in a dusty archaeological trench, and not in a modern laboratory. We must begin in ancient Athens, in the 4th century before the Common Era, in the mind of one of the most influential thinkers who ever lived. His name was Plato. Born around the year 428 BCE into one of the most distinguished aristocratic families in Athens, Plato grew up in a world of extraordinary intellectual ferment. Athens, despite its military defeats and political upheavals, remained the undisputed center of philosophy, drama, art, and democratic experimentation in the ancient world. It was a city where ideas mattered more than almost anything else, where men gathered in public squares and private gardens to debate the nature of reality, justice, truth, and the ideal society. Plato was a student of Socrates, the great questioner, the man who wandered the streets of Athens asking uncomfortable questions and challenging every assumption. When Socrates was tried and executed by the Athenian state in 399 BCE, condemned to drink hemlock for the alleged crimes of impiety and corrupting the youth, Plato was devastated. The death of his teacher would shape the rest of his life and work. It convinced him that democracy, as practiced in Athens, was deeply flawed, and it set him on a lifelong quest to define what a truly just and perfect society would look like. Plato went on to found the Academy, one of the first institutions of higher learning in the Western world, a school that would endure for centuries. He wrote dozens of dialogues, philosophical works in the form of conversations, usually featuring Socrates as the main speaker, that explored everything from the nature of love to the structure of the cosmos, from the immortality of the soul to the theory of ideal forms. And it is in two of these dialogues, written near the end of his life, probably around 360 BCE, when Plato was in his late 60s, that the story of Atlantis appears for the first and only time in all of ancient literature. The two dialogues are called the Timaeus and the Critias. In the Timaeus, the story is introduced. In the Critias, it is expanded in remarkable detail, though the Critias is unfinished, breaking off mid-sentence, as if Plato either died before completing it, abandoned it, or deliberately left it incomplete for reasons we can only guess at. Let us now enter those dialogues and hear the story as Plato told it, because every theory, every expedition, every argument about Atlantis for the past 2 millennia traces back to these words. The Timaeus opens with a conversation among 4 men: Socrates, Timaeus of Locri, Hermocrates of Syracuse, and Critias, who is either Plato's great-grandfather or a relative of that name. They have gathered to continue a discussion from the previous day about the ideal state. Socrates has outlined his vision of a perfect society, and now he asks his companions to bring that vision to life, to describe a real or imagined city that embodies those ideals and to show that city in action, particularly in war. It is Critias who responds. He tells the group that he has an extraordinary story to share, a story that is not fiction but history. A true account, he says, passed down through his family from none other than Solon, the great Athenian lawgiver and statesman, who lived roughly 200 years before Plato's time. According to Critias, Solon traveled to Egypt around 600 BCE and visited the city of Sais in the Nile Delta, where he spoke with elderly Egyptian priests at the temple of the goddess Neith. These priests, Critias says, possessed records of events stretching back thousands of years, records far older than anything the Greeks had preserved, because Egyptian civilization had endured without the catastrophic interruptions that had repeatedly destroyed Greek records and Greek memory. The priests told Solon something astonishing. They told him that the Greeks were like children, that they had no knowledge of their own ancient past. They told him that the city of Athens was, in fact, far older than the Athenians themselves believed, that it had been founded 9,000 years before Solon's visit, which would place its founding around 9600 BCE. And they told him that in those impossibly distant times, Athens had been a great and virtuous military power that had performed the most magnificent feat of arms in all of history. Athens, the priest said, had single-handedly defeated a mighty empire that had come sweeping in from beyond the Pillars of Heracles, the ancient name for the Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow passage between the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. This empire had originated on a great island, an island larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, that lay in the Atlantic Ocean beyond the strait. That island was Atlantis. The priests described Atlantis as the seat of a powerful and magnificent civilization. The kings of Atlantis, they said, ruled not only the great island itself, but also many other islands in the Atlantic and parts of the opposite continent, a vast landmass that bordered the true ocean, the great sea that surrounded all the known lands of the world. The Atlantean Empire had expanded aggressively. It had conquered parts of Libya as far as Egypt and parts of Europe as far as Tyrrhenia, the ancient name for the region of modern-day Italy inhabited by the Etruscans. It had amassed enormous military power, vast fleets and armies, and it was poised to subjugate the entire Mediterranean world, but Athens stood in its way. The priests told Solon that Athens, leading an alliance of Greek states, had resisted the Atlantean invasion. When its allies fell away, defeated or intimidated into submission, Athens fought on alone. And against all odds, Athens defeated the mighty Atlantean Empire, liberated the peoples who had been enslaved, and drove the invaders back beyond the Pillars of Heracles. But then the priests said came the catastrophe. In a single day and a single night of terrible earthquakes and floods, the island of Atlantis sank beneath the sea and vanished forever. The Athenian army was also swallowed by the earth. And the ocean where Atlantis had stood became impassable, choked with shallow mud and shoals that made navigation impossible. This, the priests told Solon, was why the Greeks had no memory of these events. The cataclysm had destroyed the records. The floods had wiped away the memory. Only Egypt, protected by the unique geography of the Nile Valley, had preserved the story. That is the essence of the Atlantis account as presented in the Timaeus, a brief but stunning narrative that raises more questions than it answers. Chapter 2. The island revealed, the Critias in detail. If the Timaeus introduces the legend, the Critias brings it to vivid, almost architectural life. In this companion dialogue, Critias, speaking as if recounting verified history, provides an extraordinarily detailed description of the island of Atlantis, its geography, its cities, its government, its religion, its military power, and its eventual moral decline. The level of detail is remarkable. It is one of the reasons why many readers, across many centuries, have wondered whether Plato was describing something real, whether he had access to a genuine tradition, perhaps transmitted through Solon, perhaps originating in Egypt, that preserved the memory of an actual place. Let us walk through the Critias and see Atlantis as Plato described it. According to the dialogue, the gods divided the earth among themselves by lot in the earliest ages of the world. The god Poseidon, lord of the sea, shaker of the earth, received the island of Atlantis as his portion. On this island, Poseidon found a mortal woman named Plato, who lived on a hill near the center of the island. Her parents had died and she was alone. Poseidon fell in love with her and made the hill her dwelling place, surrounding it with alternating rings of sea and land, 2 rings of land and 3 rings of water, to protect her and make the hill inaccessible to men. Poseidon and Plato had 5 sets of twin sons, 10 sons in all. The firstborn of the eldest pair was named Atlas, and it was after him that the island and the surrounding ocean were named Atlantis, the island of Atlas in the Atlantic Sea. Poseidon divided the island into 10 portions, 1 for each son. Atlas, as the eldest, received the largest and best portion, the central region, including the hill where his mother had lived and the rings of water surrounding it. Each of the 10 sons became the king of his portion, and the kingship was passed down through their descendants for many generations. Atlas's line held supremacy over the others. The king descended from Atlas was always the high king, the ruler of rulers, and so the dynasty of Atlantis was established. Now, Plato describes the island itself. Atlantis was enormous. As stated in the Timaeus, it was said to be larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, though scholars have debated for centuries exactly what Plato meant by these geographical terms and how literally they should be taken. The island was blessed with extraordinary natural abundance. Its soil was rich and fertile, producing 2 harvests a year, one from the winter rains and one from irrigation in the summer. It was covered with forests so dense that they provided timber for every conceivable purpose. It was home to a vast array of animals, including elephants, a detail that has intrigued many researchers, since elephants are not native to any Atlantic island known today. The island produced every kind of food, spice, and fragrance. It yielded a mysterious substance that Plato calls orichalcum, a metal or alloy second in value only to gold, which gleamed with a reddish light and was used extensively in the construction and decoration of Atlantean buildings. The identity of orichalcum has been debated for millennia. Some scholars believe it was a form of bronze or brass. Others have suggested it was a now lost alloy. Still others believe it was entirely fictional. But the most extraordinary descriptions in the Critias concern the capital city of Atlantis, the royal metropolis built on and around the central hill where Plato had once lived. Over the generations, the kings of Atlantis transformed the rings of land and water left by Poseidon into an engineering marvel, unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. They dug a great canal from the outermost ring of water to the sea, a channel wide enough and deep enough for the largest ships of the era to sail through. This canal ran straight for approximately 50 stadia, roughly 9 kilometers or 5.5 miles, connecting the innermost rings to the open ocean. They bridged the rings of water, creating passages that allowed ships to sail from one ring to the next. They carved tunnels through the rings of land, large enough for a single trireme, a warship, to pass through. They roofed these tunnels over, creating covered waterways. The outermost ring of land was surrounded by a great stone wall, and this wall was coated in brass. The wall around the next ring of land was coated with tin. And the wall around the innermost ring, the ring closest to the central island, was coated with orichalcum, which Plato says sparkled like fire. On the central island itself stood the royal palace and the great temple of Poseidon. The temple of Poseidon was one stadium long, about 180 meters or 600 feet, half a stadium wide and proportionately tall. Its exterior was covered entirely in silver, except for the pinnacles, which were covered in gold. Inside, the ceiling was ivory, adorned with gold, silver, and orichalcum. The walls, pillars, and floors were lined with orichalcum. Within the temple stood a colossal golden statue of Poseidon driving a chariot drawn by 6 winged horses, his head touching the roof. Around him were placed 100 golden statues of Nereids, sea nymphs, riding on dolphins. Outside the temple were golden statues of all the original 10 kings and their queens, along with many other offerings from the kings of Atlantis and from subject nations. The royal palace, which had been built up and embellished by each successive king, each trying to outdo his predecessor, was a marvel of opulence and scale. Its exact dimensions are not given, but Plato makes clear that it was vast and lavishly decorated. The rings of land were not empty, they were densely developed. The outer rings contained harbors, dockyards, and warehouses. The harbors were crowded with ships and merchants from around the world. The rings closest to the center were reserved for the military and the nobility. Guard houses and barracks were positioned on the bridges and gates. The Atlanteans also constructed 2 springs on the central island, one of hot water and one of cold water. They built elaborate bathing facilities, separate for the kings, for private citizens, for women, and even for horses and other animals. The used water was directed to the sacred grove of Poseidon, where trees of extraordinary size and beauty grew, nourished by the rich soil and the abundance of water. On the great plain to the south of the capital city, a rectangular plain that Plato says measured 3,000 stadia by 2,000 stadia, roughly 555 kilometers by 370 kilometers, or 345 miles by 230 miles, the Atlanteans had constructed an enormous network of irrigation canals. These canals criss-crossed the plain in a regular grid pattern, dividing it into thousands of lots. Each lot was assigned to a district leader who was responsible for providing a fixed quota of soldiers, chariots, horses, and ships in time of war. The military power of Atlantis was staggering. From the royal city and the surrounding plain alone, the Atlanteans could muster 10,000 war chariots, 1,200 warships, and an army of over 1,000,000 men, including heavy infantry, archers, slingers, javelin throwers, and sailors. And this was only the contribution of the central district ruled by the descendants of Atlas. The other 9 kingdoms contributed their own forces according to the laws laid down by Poseidon and inscribed on a pillar of orichalcum in the temple. The 10 kings of Atlantis were bound by sacred laws. Every 5th and 6th year alternately, they gathered in the temple of Poseidon to consult on matters of common interest and to judge whether any of their number had transgressed the laws. Before their deliberations, they performed a remarkable ritual. Bulls were allowed to roam freely within the temple precincts. The 10 kings, using only staves and nooses, no metal weapons, hunted one of the bulls and captured it. They then led the bull to the great pillar of orichalcum on which the laws of Poseidon were inscribed, and there they slaughtered it, letting its blood flow over the inscribed laws. They dipped a golden cup into the blood, poured libations into the fire, and swore solemn oaths to judge and be judged according to the laws on the pillar. They drank from the cup, dedicated it to the temple, and then dined together. After nightfall, they put on robes of dark blue, a color associated with the sea and with Poseidon, and sat in judgment through the night, writing their judgments on golden tablets that were placed in the temple as a memorial. Among the most important of these laws was the prohibition against any king making war on his kinsmen. All 10 kingdoms were to come to one another's aid if any were attacked, but the line of Atlas always held the supreme command. For many generations, Plato tells us, the kings of Atlantis obeyed these laws. They were virtuous, wise, and moderate. They possessed enormous wealth and power, but they did not let it corrupt them. They valued virtue above possessions, treated their riches with a kind of detached amusement, and understood that true greatness came not from gold and silver but from moral excellence and mutual friendship. But then inevitably, tragically, the divine nature within them began to fade. As the bloodline of Poseidon was diluted by repeated intermarriage with mortals, the divine element in the Atlantean kings grew weaker and weaker, until the mortal nature gained the upper hand. They became greedy, arrogant, and unjust. To those who had eyes to see, they appeared base and ugly, having lost the fairest of their treasures, their virtue. But to those who were blind to true happiness, they appeared more glorious and blessed than ever, precisely because they were now full of lawless ambition and power. And it was at this moment, when Atlantis had reached the peak of its external magnificence but the nadir of its moral character, that Zeus, the king of the gods, decided to punish them. He saw the corruption of this once noble race and determined to impose a penalty that would humble them and perhaps bring them back to their senses. Zeus gathered all the gods in their most honored dwelling place, the center of the universe, from which all things that partake of generation are beheld, and when they were assembled, he spoke. And here, maddeningly, frustratingly, the Critias breaks off, mid-sentence. In the middle of Zeus's speech, we never hear what Zeus said. We never read Plato's account of the destruction itself, the earthquakes, the floods, the single day and night of horror that swallowed Atlantis beneath the waves. The dialogue simply stops. Was Plato too old, too ill, too close to death to finish? Did he lose interest? Did he deliberately leave the ending unwritten, trusting his readers to supply the catastrophe from the brief account in the Timaeus? Or was the missing ending lost at some point in the centuries of copying and transmission that preserved Plato's works? We do not know, we may never know, and this incompleteness, this tantalizing gap, has only added to the mystery and the fascination. Chapter 3. What did Plato mean? Before we chase the legend across oceans and millennia, we must pause and ask a question that scholars have debated furiously for over 2,000 years. Did Plato intend the story of Atlantis to be taken as historical fact, or was it a philosophical allegory, a fictional parable designed to illustrate a moral point? This is not a trivial question. The answer fundamentally shapes how we approach the entire mystery. Those who believe the story is pure fiction, an invention of Plato's imagination, point to several compelling arguments. First, they note that Plato was a philosopher, not a historian. His dialogues are filled with myths, allegories, and invented stories that he used to illustrate philosophical points. The allegory of the cave, the allegory of the chariot, the allegory of 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 the allegory. Plato loved allegory. He explicitly states in several of his works that myths can be more effective than logical arguments for conveying certain truths. Is Atlantis simply another such myth? Second, they note that no other ancient Greek writer before Plato mentions Atlantis. If Solon had truly brought back from Egypt the knowledge of a vast Atlantic civilization that had once invaded the Mediterranean, surely someone would have mentioned it in the 200 years between Solon and Plato. Herodotus, the great historian who visited Egypt and wrote extensively about its history and customs, says nothing about Atlantis. Thucydides, who wrote the most rigorous history of the ancient world, says nothing. No Egyptian text that has ever been discovered mentions Atlantis or anything resembling it. Third, they observe that the story fits almost too perfectly into Plato's philosophical framework. The virtuous early Atlantis, blessed by the gods, gradually corrupted by wealth and power, and finally punished by divine justice. This is a textbook illustration of Plato's views on the degeneration of the ideal state. The Athens that defeats Atlantis, virtuous, selfless, fighting for the freedom of others, is essentially the ideal city that Plato describes in his Republic. The story seems designed to demonstrate philosophical principles, not to record historical events. Fourth, they point out specific elements that seem to serve a literary or philosophical purpose rather than a historical one. The 10 kings, 5 sets of twins born to a god, this has a mythological flavor, not a historical one. The elaborate ritual with the bull, the orichalcum pillar, the blue robes, the golden cups of blood, These feel like the inventions of a storyteller, not the report of a historian. Aristotle, Plato's own student and one of the greatest minds in history, apparently did not believe the story was true. A later commentator, Strabo, reports that Aristotle said of Atlantis, "He who invented it also destroyed it," implying that Plato made the whole thing up and then conveniently sank it beneath the ocean to explain why no evidence could be found. On the other side of the debate, those who believe Plato was recording a genuine tradition, whether perfectly or imperfectly, have their own compelling arguments. They note that Plato goes to unusual lengths to establish the historicity of the Atlantis story. He presents it not as a myth or a hypothetical, but as a true account transmitted through a specific chain of authority, from Egyptian priests to Solon, from Solon to his family, and through his family to Critias. Plato provides names, dates, and genealogies, the kind of details that ancient writers typically use to establish the credibility of historical narratives, not fictional ones. In the Timaeus, Critias says explicitly, "Listen then, Socrates, to a tale which, though passing strange, is yet wholly true, as Solon, the wisest of the 7 sages, once declared." And later, "It is not a fiction, but genuine history. These are not the words of a man introducing an allegory." Plato's other myths are clearly labeled as myths. The Atlantis story is presented as fact. They also point out that many of the specific details in the story, the geography, the geology, the descriptions of natural resources, the military organization, are oddly precise for a philosophical parable. Why describe the exact dimensions of the Great Plain, the number of war chariots, the arrangement of canals in a grid pattern, the separation of hot and cold springs, the presence of elephants? These details don't serve the philosophical point. They seem to be there because they were part of the tradition Plato was recording. Furthermore, while it is true that no pre-Platonic Greek source mentions Atlantis by name, there are scattered references in earlier Greek literature to great islands in the Western Ocean, to civilizations beyond the Pillars of Heracles, and to catastrophic floods that destroyed ancient peoples. Homer, Hesiod, and other poets speak of blessed isles in the West. Herodotus and other writers describe the Western Ocean as vast and mysterious. The idea that there were great lands and civilizations beyond the limits of the known world was not unique to Plato. And then there is the question of Egypt. The Egyptians did, in fact, possess historical records stretching back far beyond anything the Greeks had preserved. Egyptian priests were famous throughout the ancient world for their knowledge of the deep past. It is entirely plausible that they told Solon stories about events thousands of years old, stories that the Greeks, with their shorter institutional memory, had forgotten. The debate between these two positions has never been definitively resolved. Most mainstream classical scholars today lean toward the allegorical interpretation. They believe Plato invented the story, or at least elaborated it beyond recognition from some much simpler kernel, to serve his philosophical purposes. But a significant minority of scholars, along with many independent researchers and a vast popular audience, continue to believe that the story contains at least a core of historical truth. And it is that possibility, that tantalizing, seductive, maddening possibility, that has driven the search for Atlantis for 23 centuries. Chapter 4. The ancient world debates. Plato died around 348 BCE, and the debate about Atlantis began almost immediately. His immediate successors at the academy, including his nephew Speusippus and later heads of the school, took varying positions on the question. Some accepted the story as essentially historical, others treated it as philosophical myth. The debate within Plato's own school set the pattern for everything that followed. Crantor of Soli, a philosopher of the 3rd century BCE who wrote one of the earliest commentaries on the Timaeus, reportedly claimed that the story was literally true. According to later sources, particularly the Neoplatonist philosopher Proclus, writing in the 5th century CE, Crantor went so far as to say that Egyptian priests had shown him pillars on which the history of Atlantis was inscribed. If this account is accurate, it would be remarkable evidence, but the report comes to us at second or third hand, separated from Crantor by several centuries, and its reliability is uncertain. Aristotle, as we have noted, appears to have been skeptical. But Aristotle was skeptical about many things in Plato's philosophy, and his dismissal of the Atlantis story may have been part of a broader pattern of intellectual rivalry and disagreement with his former teacher. In the centuries that followed, as Greek culture spread across the Mediterranean and eventually merged with Roman culture, the Atlantis story was discussed, debated, and interpreted by numerous writers and thinkers. Posidonius, the great Stoic philosopher and polymath of the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, apparently believed that the Atlantis story might be true. He was interested in geography, oceanography, and the geological changes that had shaped the Earth over time, and he seems to have regarded Plato's account as at least plausible. Strabo, the Greek geographer writing around the turn of the Common Era, was more ambivalent. He records Posidonius's view, but also notes Aristotle's skepticism. Strabo seems to lean toward the view that the story was invented, but he does not dismiss it entirely. Plutarch, the great biographer and moralist of the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, mentions Atlantis in his Life of Solon. He confirms that Solon visited Egypt and that he began a great poem based on a story told to him by Egyptian priests, a poem that he never finished because of old age and the press of public affairs. Plutarch does not express a clear opinion on whether the story was true, but his account of Solon's Egyptian visit and unfinished poem is consistent with the chain of transmission that Plato describes. Diodorus Siculus, the Greek historian of the 1st century BCE, describes in his Universal History a people called the Atlantioi who lived on a great island in the Western Ocean and who were invaded by the Amazons. While his account does not match Plato's in every detail, the similarities are suggestive. Some scholars believe Diodorus was drawing on an independent tradition, others think he was simply elaborating on Plato. Pliny the Elder, the Roman naturalist and encyclopedist, makes passing references to sunken lands in the Atlantic, but does not specifically discuss Plato's Atlantis. Among the later Neoplatonist philosophers, particularly Proclus and Iamblichus, writing in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, there was a strong tendency to accept the Atlantis story as literally true. The Neoplatonists revered Plato as an almost divinely inspired figure, and they were inclined to take his statements at face value. Proclus, in his commentary on the Timaeus, provides extensive discussion of the Atlantis account and cites multiple authorities, including Crantor, in support of its historicity. But even among those who accepted the story as true, there was no consensus about what exactly had happened. Was Atlantis a continent, an island, a collection of islands? Where exactly were the pillars of Heracles? How literally should the dimensions and dates be taken? These questions were debated in antiquity just as they are debated today. With the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE and the onset of the early medieval period in Western Europe, knowledge of Plato's dialogues became scarce. The Timaeus was the only Platonic dialogue continuously available in Latin translation throughout the medieval period, thanks to a partial translation by Chalcidius in the 4th century. The Critias, however, was essentially unknown in Western Europe until the Renaissance. This did not mean that the idea of Atlantis disappeared. References to a great island in the Western Ocean appeared in various medieval texts, sometimes drawing on Plato, sometimes drawing on Arabic sources that had preserved Greek learning, and sometimes drawing on independent Celtic, Norse, or other traditions about paradisiacal islands beyond the sunset. The Irish legend of High Brasil, a phantom island said to appear in the Atlantic every 7 years, may or may not be related to the Atlantis tradition, but it reflects the same deep human longing for a hidden paradise in the Western Sea. The Norse sagas speak of Vinland and other Western lands. Arab geographers described mysterious islands in the Sea of Darkness, their name for the Atlantic. But it was the Renaissance, that great rebirth of classical learning, that brought Atlantis roaring back into European consciousness. Chapter 5. The Renaissance Rediscovery. In 1462, the Italian philosopher Marsilio Ficino completed the first full Latin translation of all of Plato's dialogues, including both the Timaeus and the Critias. For the first time in 1,000 years, the complete Atlantis story was available to Western European readers, and its impact was explosive. The timing could not have been more dramatic. Ficino published his translations in the same decade that European explorers were beginning to push westward into the Atlantic, driven by a combination of economic ambition, religious zeal, scientific curiosity, and, yes, legends of mysterious western lands. When Christopher Columbus sailed west in 1492 and encountered the islands of the Caribbean, and when subsequent explorers encountered the great continental landmasses beyond, the connection to Plato's story was impossible to ignore. Plato had written about a great island or continent in the Atlantic beyond the Pillars of Heracles. Now European explorers were finding exactly that, great islands and vast continents in the Western Ocean. Was the New World the same as Atlantis? Or was it the opposite continent that Plato had described as lying beyond Atlantis, the great landmass that bordered the true ocean? The Spanish historian Francisco López de Gamarra, writing in 1553, was one of the first to explicitly suggest that the newly discovered lands across the Atlantic were the remains of Plato's Atlantis. Others followed. The idea that the indigenous civilizations encountered by European explorers, the Aztecs, the Maya, the Inca, were descendants of the Atlanteans became a popular and persistent theory. This theory was deeply problematic in many ways. It was often used to deny the indigenous peoples credit for their own remarkable achievements, implying that their civilizations must have been derived from a superior outside source. It was entangled with the racial theories and colonial ideologies of the era. And it had no real evidence to support it beyond superficial similarities and wishful thinking. But it planted a seed that would grow for centuries, the idea that Atlantis was not just a story, but a real place that could be found, and that its influence could be detected in the ruins and traditions of living civilizations around the world. Chapter 6, Ignatius Donnelly and the birth of Atlantology. For 3 centuries after Ficino's translations, the Atlantis question simmered in European intellectual life, discussed by scholars, referenced by poets, speculated about by geographers, but never the subject of a sustained, systematic investigation. That changed in 1882, with the publication of a book that would transform the Atlantis question from a scholarly curiosity into a global phenomenon. The book was called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, and its author was Ignatius Loyola Donnelly, a politician, writer, and self-taught polymath from the state of Minnesota who had served as a congressman, founded a utopian colony, and developed an insatiable appetite for grand, sweeping theories about everything from Shakespeare's authorship to the cataclysms that had shaped the earth. Donnelly's book was a sensation. It went through over 50 editions, was translated into numerous languages, and remains in print to this day. It was endorsed by the British Prime Minister William Ewart Gladstone, who was so impressed that he asked the cabinet to fund an expedition to find Atlantis. The cabinet declined. What made Donnelly's book so powerful was not its scholarship, which was often sloppy, selective, and outdated even by the standards of his time, but its scope, its passion, and the sheer audacity of its central claims. Donnelly argued that Plato's Atlantis was not a myth but a historical fact. He proposed that there had once been a large island, perhaps a small continent in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, roughly opposite the mouth of the Mediterranean Sea. This island, he said, was the original homeland of human civilization. From Atlantis, he argued, colonists had spread out to populate the shores of the Atlantic on both sides, founding the civilizations of ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, and Western Europe on one side, and the civilizations of the Maya, Aztecs, and other indigenous peoples on the other. Donnelly marshaled an enormous body of evidence, or what he considered evidence, to support his case. He pointed to similarities between the cultures on opposite sides of the Atlantic: the building of pyramids in both Egypt and central Mexico, the practice of mummification, the use of similar calendars, the worship of sun gods, the legends of a great flood found in cultures around the world. He argued that these similarities were too numerous and too specific to be coincidental, that they must reflect a common origin, and that common origin was Atlantis. He also drew on the emerging science of geology. He noted that the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, a vast underwater mountain range running down the center of the Atlantic Ocean, discovered during the laying of the first transatlantic telegraph cables, might be the remnant of a sunken continent. He argued that volcanic and seismic activity could have caused a large landmass in the Atlantic to sink beneath the waves, just as Plato described. Donnelly's 13 propositions, laid out in the opening pages of his book, became the foundation of what would later be called Atlantology, the study of and search for Atlantis. Among them were the claims that Atlantis was the region where humanity first rose from barbarism to civilization, that it was the original source of the Bronze Age, that the gods and goddesses of the ancient Greeks, Phoenicians, Hindus, and Scandinavians were simply the kings, queens, and heroes of Atlantis, deified by later generations, and that the oldest colony of Atlantis was probably Egypt, whose civilization reproduced that of the mother country. These claims were enormously influential, and they continue to echo in popular culture to this day, but they were also deeply flawed. Donnelly's comparative method, pointing to similarities between cultures on opposite sides of the Atlantic and attributing them to a common Atlantean origin, has been thoroughly critiqued by modern anthropologists and archaeologists. Many of the similarities he cited were superficial, exaggerated, or simply wrong. Pyramids in Egypt and pyramids in Central America, for example, were built thousands of years apart, using different techniques for different purposes by cultures with no demonstrable connection. The practice of mummification, while found in both Egypt and some South American cultures, developed independently in response to similar environmental conditions and similar beliefs about the afterlife. Furthermore, the idea that all civilization originated from a single source, what scholars call hyperdiffusionism, has been abandoned by mainstream academia. The evidence overwhelmingly shows that complex societies arose independently in multiple parts of the world, at different times, in response to local conditions. There is no need to posit a lost mother civilization to explain the development of agriculture, writing, architecture, or political organization in the Nile Valley, the Fertile Crescent, the Indus Valley, the Yellow River Basin, or Mesoamerica. And the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, while real and impressive, is not the remnant of a sunken continent. Modern plate tectonics, a science that did not exist in Donnelly's time, has shown that the ridge is a divergent plate boundary, a place where the ocean floor is being created as tectonic plates pull apart. The Atlantic Ocean is getting wider, not narrower. There was no continental landmass in the middle of the Atlantic within the last 100 million years, let alone within the last 12,000. But despite these scientific objections, Donnelly's vision of Atlantis proved irresistible to a vast popular audience. He had given the legend a modern framework, pseudo-scientific, sweeping, romantic, that resonated with the spirit of his age, an age of exploration, discovery, and the belief that the past held secrets waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 7, The Theosophists and the Mystical Atlantis. If Donnelly gave Atlantis a pseudo-scientific framework, the Theosophists gave it a mystical one. Theosophy was a spiritual movement founded in New York City in 1875 by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, a Russian-born mystic and writer of extraordinary charisma and controversial reputation. Blavatsky claimed to have received hidden knowledge from spiritual masters, Mahatmas, who resided in Tibet and who preserved the secret wisdom of the ages. In her massive and bewildering works, particularly The Secret Doctrine, published in 1888, Blavatsky outlined a cosmic history of humanity that included a series of root races, each associated with a different continent and a different stage of spiritual and physical evolution. The fourth root race, she claimed, was the Atlantean race, which had inhabited a great continent in the Atlantic Ocean. The Atlanteans, according to Blavatsky, were a physically imposing people. Some accounts say they were giants who possessed advanced psychic and spiritual powers. Their civilization was brought down by their misuse of these powers, and their continent was destroyed in a series of catastrophes that unfolded over millions of years. Blavatsky's Atlantis bore little resemblance to Plato's. Her timeline was vastly longer. She spoke of millions of years, not thousands. Her Atlanteans were not just an advanced Bronze Age civilization, but a fundamentally different kind of humanity, with psychic abilities and a spiritual technology unknown to modern science. Her account drew not only on Plato, but on Hindu mythology, Buddhist cosmology, and what she claimed were ancient Tibetan texts. After Blavatsky's death in 1891, her followers, particularly W. Scott Elliott, who published The Story of Atlantis in 1896, elaborated her account in ever greater detail, producing maps of the lost continent, describing its cities and temples, and tracing the migration of the Atlantean root race after the catastrophe. The theosophical version of Atlantis was enormously influential, particularly in the early 20th century. It inspired a vast body of occult and New Age literature. It influenced artists, writers, and spiritual seekers around the world, and it permanently fused the Atlantis legend with ideas about lost spiritual knowledge, psychic powers, crystal technology, and the existence of hidden masters who preserve ancient wisdom. This fusion has proved extremely durable. To this day, many popular books, websites, and documentaries about Atlantis draw heavily, often without acknowledgement, on theosophical ideas. The image of Atlantis as a civilization of crystal pyramids, telepathic communication, and advanced energy technology owes far more to Blavatsky and her followers than to anything Plato ever wrote. It should be noted that theosophy and its offshoots have been criticized extensively for pseudoscience, for cultural appropriation, and for the racial hierarchies embedded in the concept of root races. The theory that humanity evolves through a fixed sequence of racial stages, with some races more advanced than others, has deeply troubling implications and was, in fact, used by various racist and nationalist movements in the 20th century to justify their ideologies. The lesson here is important. The Atlantis legend, like many powerful myths, is not neutral. It can be and has been used to support a wide range of agendas, some benign and some profoundly dangerous. The search for Atlantis has always been as much about the searchers as about the searched for. Chapter 8, Atlantis in The Atlantic, the classic theory. Let us now turn from the history of the legend to the geography of the search. Where was Atlantis? Where might it have been? Where have people looked and what have they found? The most obvious place to look for Atlantis is in the Atlantic Ocean. Plato says explicitly that the island was located beyond the Pillars of Heracles, beyond the Strait of Gibraltar in the Atlantic Sea. He says it was a great island from which one could cross to other islands, and from those islands to the opposite continent that surrounded the true ocean. If we take Plato at his word, Atlantis was an island or small continent in the Atlantic Ocean, probably somewhere between the Strait of Gibraltar and the landmasses of the Western Hemisphere. This is the classic Atlantis theory, the one proposed by Donnelly and embraced by generations of Atlantis enthusiasts. The Canary Islands, the Azores, the Madeira Archipelago, and the Cape Verde Islands have all been proposed as remnants of Atlantis mountaintops of a sunken landmass that once protruded above the Atlantic waves. The Canary Islands, located off the northwest coast of Africa, have been a particularly popular candidate. When European explorers arrived in the 14th and 15th centuries, they found the islands inhabited by the Guanches, a people with a distinctive culture, a language unrelated to any other known tongue, and physical characteristics that some researchers linked to North African or even European populations. The Guanches practiced mummification, lived in stone structures, and had legends of a great cataclysm. Some Atlantis researchers have argued that the Guanches were descendants of Atlantean survivors who found refuge on the mountain tops of their sinking homeland. The Azores, a group of volcanic islands in the mid-Atlantic roughly 1,500 kilometers west of Portugal, have also attracted attention. Their position near the mid-Atlantic ridge and their volcanic origin have led some to speculate that they are the remnants of a larger landmass. In 2013, a Portuguese sailor reported finding what appeared to be a large underwater pyramid near the Azores, sparking widespread media coverage and renewed speculation. However, the claim was investigated by the Portuguese Navy and found to be based on unreliable sonar readings. No pyramid was confirmed. The Bahamas have been another focus of attention, particularly since the discovery in 1968 of the so-called Bimini Road, an underwater formation off the coast of North Bimini Island in the Bahamas that appears to consist of large, regularly shaped limestone blocks arranged in a linear pattern. The formation was quickly linked to a prediction by the famous psychic Edgar Cayce, who in the 1930s had claimed that remnants of Atlantis would be found near Bimini in 1968 or 1969. The Bimini Road sparked intense debate. Some researchers, particularly the zoologist and Atlantis enthusiast Manson Valentine, who made the initial discovery, argued that it was a man-made structure, possibly a road, a wall, or a harbor, dating to a period when sea levels were lower and the formation was above water. Others, including most geologists who have studied the site, argue that it is a natural geological formation, a type of beach rock that fractures into regular, block-like shapes as it erodes. Subsequent investigations have produced mixed results. Some studies have found evidence of what appear to be additional stone structures in the waters around Bimini, including what some researchers describe as rectangular buildings and stone circles. Others have found nothing that cannot be explained by natural geological processes. The Bimini Road remains controversial. It is not accepted as an archaeological site by mainstream science. But it continues to attract divers, researchers, and enthusiasts who believe it may be a fragment of a lost civilization. The fundamental problem with all Atlantic theories, however, is geological. As we noted in our discussion of Donnelly, modern plate tectonics has demonstrated that there has been no large landmass in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean for tens of millions of years. The Atlantic is getting wider, not narrower. The ocean floor is young, created at the mid-Atlantic ridge and slowly spreading outward. There is simply no geological evidence for a sunken continent or large island in the Atlantic within the timeframe of human history. This does not mean that no land has ever been lost to the sea in the Atlantic region. Sea levels have risen dramatically since the end of the last ice age, by approximately 120 meters or 400 feet, and vast areas of coastal lowland that were inhabited by ancient peoples are now underwater. The Dogger Bank in the North Sea, for example, was once a thriving inhabited landscape, part of a land bridge connecting Britain to continental Europe, that was gradually flooded as sea levels rose between roughly 8,000 and 6,000 BCE. Similar flooding occurred along coastlines around the world, but these were gradual processes, not sudden cataclysms, and the land that was lost was coastal lowland, not a continent-sized island. The geological evidence does not support the existence of Atlantis as described by Plato anywhere in the Atlantic Ocean, and yet the Atlantic theory will not die, partly because Plato's words seem so clear, partly because the romance of a lost continent beneath the waves is so powerful, and partly because, as we shall see, some researchers have proposed creative reinterpretations of the evidence that, while still speculative, are not quite so easily dismissed. Chapter 9, The Mediterranean Hypothesis, Minoan Crete and the Eruption of Thera. If the Atlantic Ocean cannot accommodate Atlantis, what about the Mediterranean? This is where one of the most compelling and widely discussed theories about Atlantis originates, a theory that links the legend not to a sunken Atlantic continent, but to a very real, very well-documented catastrophe that struck the ancient Mediterranean world roughly 3,500 years ago. The theory centers on two places: the island of Crete, home of the Minoan civilization, and the volcanic island of Thera, known today as Santorini, located about 70 miles north of Crete in the Aegean Sea. To understand this theory, we must first understand the Minoans. The Minoan civilization is one of the most remarkable in all of human history. Named after the legendary King Minos of Greek mythology, the king who kept the Minotaur in the labyrinth, the Minoans flourished on the island of Crete from roughly 2700 BCE to about 1450 BCE. They were the first advanced civilization in Europe, predating classical Greece by more than 1,000 years. The Minoans were extraordinary in many ways. They built magnificent palace complexes, the most famous at Knossos, but also at Phaistos, Malia, and Zakros, that were engineering marvels, with elaborate drainage systems, light wells, multiple stories, and beautiful frescoes depicting dolphins, acrobats, processions, and scenes from nature. Their art was vibrant, colorful, and naturalistic, strikingly different from the more formal and rigid art of contemporary Egypt and Mesopotamia. The Minoans were a maritime power. Their fleet dominated the eastern Mediterranean. They traded with Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, and the islands of the Aegean. They developed a writing system too, in fact, Linear A, which has never been deciphered, and Linear B, which was deciphered in 1952 and found to be an early form of Greek, though it may have been adopted by later Mycenaean rulers on Crete rather than by the original Minoans. The Minoans appear to have been relatively peaceful, at least compared to later Greek civilizations. Their palaces were unfortified, a remarkable fact that suggests they felt secure enough, perhaps protected by their naval power, that they did not need walls. Their art depicts very few scenes of warfare. Some scholars have speculated that Minoan society was more egalitarian and less patriarchal than later Mediterranean civilizations, though this remains debated. The Minoans also practiced bull leaping, a ritual or sport in which athletes would grasp the horns of a charging bull and vault over its back. This practice, depicted in numerous Minoan frescoes and sculptures, has obvious echoes in Plato's description of the Atlantean ritual of the bull hunt in the Temple of Poseidon. In short, the Minoans were a wealthy, sophisticated maritime civilization with a distinctive culture, a civilization that flourished for over a millennium and then, quite suddenly, collapsed. And this is where Thera comes in. Thera, modern Santorini, was, in Minoan times, a roughly circular volcanic island with a thriving Minoan settlement on its southern coast. Excavations at the site of Akrotiri, begun in 1967 by the Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos, have revealed a remarkably well-preserved town, often called the Minoan Pompeii, with multi-story buildings, elaborate frescoes, sophisticated drainage, and a wealth of artifacts. The town was buried under meters of volcanic ash, which preserved it in extraordinary detail. Sometime around 1600 BCE, the exact date is debated, with estimates ranging from about 1650 to 1500 BCE, the volcano at the heart of Thera erupted in one of the most powerful volcanic explosions in human history. The eruption was so massive that it blew the center of the island apart, creating the caldera, the vast, roughly circular bay that defines the shape of Santorini today. The eruption expelled an estimated 60 cubic kilometers of magma and ash into the atmosphere, roughly 4 times the volume ejected by the eruption of Krakatoa in 1883. The ash cloud would have darkened the sky across the eastern Mediterranean. Tsunamis generated by the eruption and the collapse of the caldera would have radiated outward, striking the coastlines of Crete, mainland Greece, Turkey, and the Levant. The effects on the Minoan civilization were devastating. The settlement at Akrotiri was completely buried. Coastal settlements on the northern shore of Crete appear to have been damaged by tsunamis. The ash fall may have rendered agricultural land infertile for years. The disruption of maritime trade routes would have been severe, Within a few generations of the eruption, the exact timeline is debated. The Minoan civilization collapsed. The great palaces were destroyed or abandoned. The Mycenaeans, a mainland Greek people who had previously been influenced by and perhaps subordinate to the Minoans, took control of Crete and the Aegean. In 1909, a young scholar named K.T. Frost published an article in the Times of London suggesting that Plato's Atlantis was inspired by the Minoan civilization. In 1939, Spiridon Marinatos, the same archaeologist who would later excavate Akrotiri, published a landmark paper arguing that the destruction of the Minoan civilization was caused by the eruption of Thera, and that this catastrophe was the historical basis for the Atlantis legend. The theory was further developed in the 1960s by the Greek seismologist Angelos Gallinopoulos, who proposed an elegant solution to one of the major problems with identifying Atlantis as Minoan Crete, the discrepancy in dates and dimensions. Plato says that Atlantis existed 9,000 years before Solon's visit to Egypt, which would place it around 9600 BCE, roughly 8,000 years before the Minoan civilization. He also gives dimensions for the island and its structures that are vastly larger than anything on Crete or Thera. Gallinopoulos proposed that these numbers had been multiplied by a factor of 10, either through a translation error between Egyptian and Greek or through a misreading of Egyptian numerals. If you divide Plato's dates and dimensions by 10, the results are striking. 9,000 years becomes 900 years, placing the catastrophe around 1500 BCE, right in the range of the Thera eruption. The dimensions of the Great Plain, which Plato gives as roughly 555 by 370 kilometers, become 55 by 37 kilometers, which is a reasonable approximation for the Messara Plain on Crete. This is an elegant theory, and it has attracted significant support. The parallels between Minoan Crete and Plato's Atlantis are numerous and suggestive. Both were island civilizations, both were maritime powers, both were wealthy and sophisticated, both featured elaborate palace complexes, both practiced bull rituals, both were destroyed by a natural catastrophe. The timing, if Gallinopoulos' factor of 10 correction is accepted, matches. The geography, an island in the sea south of mainland Greece, is at least broadly consistent. Furthermore, the idea that the memory of the Minoan catastrophe was preserved in Egypt and transmitted to Solon is plausible. The Egyptians had extensive contact with the Minoans. Minoan artifacts have been found in Egypt, and Egyptian artifacts have been found on Crete. The Egyptians would certainly have known about the eruption and its aftermath. It is conceivable that they preserved a garbled account of these events in their temple records, and that this account, further garbled in transmission from Egyptian to Greek, eventually reached Plato. But the theory also faces significant objections. The most obvious objection is that Plato says Atlantis was beyond the Pillars of Heracles in the Atlantic, not in the Aegean. The Minoan theory requires us to believe that Plato was either wrong about the location, confused about the location, or deliberately changed the location for dramatic or philosophical purposes. This is a significant departure from the text. Plato also says that Atlantis was larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, a description that cannot possibly apply to Crete, which is a large island but hardly a continent. The factor of 10 correction can be applied to some numbers, but it strains credulity to apply it selectively and inconsistently. Furthermore, the Minoan civilization did not disappear in a single day and a single night. The eruption of Thera was indeed sudden and catastrophic, but the collapse of Minoan civilization was a process that unfolded over decades or even centuries. The island of Crete did not sink beneath the sea. It is still there, very much above water, exactly where it has always been, and there is the question of the war. Plato's story centers on a military conflict between Atlantis and Athens, a great war in which Athens heroically defeated the Atlantean invasion. There is no archaeological evidence of a war between the Minoans and Athens in the relevant period. Indeed, in the period of Minoan dominance, Athens was a relatively minor settlement, nothing like the great military power described in the Critias. Despite these objections, the Minoan Thera theory remains one of the most widely discussed and seriously considered explanations for the Atlantis legend. It has the enormous advantage of being grounded in real history and real archaeology. It connects the legend to events that actually happened, places that actually exist, and a civilization that was genuinely remarkable. And it provides a plausible mechanism for the transmission of the story from the historical event to Plato's account, through Egyptian records, through Solon, through oral tradition, through the natural processes of garbling and exaggeration that affect all stories transmitted across cultures and centuries. Whether it is the correct explanation is another matter entirely. Chapter 10, the Richat structure, the Eye of the Sahara in recent years, a new and startling candidate for the location of Atlantis, has captured the imagination of researchers and the public alike. It is not in the ocean at all. It is in the middle of the Sahara Desert in the West African nation of Mauritania. It is called the Richat structure, or more evocatively, the Eye of the Sahara. The Richat structure is a geological formation approximately 40 kilometers, 25 miles in diameter. When viewed from above, from an airplane, or more dramatically, from space, it appears as a series of concentric rings, alternating between ridges and valleys, centered on a dome-like elevation. The resemblance to a giant eye staring up from the desert floor is so striking that it has been used as a landmark by astronauts in orbit. The Richat structure was long assumed to be an impact crater, the scar left by a meteorite or asteroid. But geological investigation in the late 20th century revealed that it is not an impact structure. It is a deeply eroded geological dome, a place where the Earth's crust was pushed upward by forces from below and then worn down over millions of years by erosion, revealing the concentric layers of rock beneath. So what does this have to do with Atlantis? The connection was first proposed in detail by a number of independent researchers in the 2010s and gained widespread public attention through online documentaries and social media discussions. The argument rests on a series of striking parallels between the Richat structure and Plato's description of the capital city of Atlantis. First, the concentric rings. Plato describes Atlantis as a city built on a central island surrounded by alternating rings of water and land. The Richat structure is a formation of concentric rings. The visual resemblance is undeniable. Second, the dimensions. Plato gives the diameter of the outermost ring of Atlantis as approximately 127 stadia, which translates to roughly 23 to 27 kilometers, depending on the conversion factor used. The Richat structure is approximately 23.5 kilometers across its innermost rings and roughly 40 kilometers across its outermost features. The match is not perfect, but it is suggestive. Third, the location. Plato says that Atlantis was beyond the Pillars of Heracles, beyond the Strait of Gibraltar. Mauritania is indeed beyond the Strait of Gibraltar to the southwest. If the Sahara was once wetter, and we know from geological and climatological evidence that it was, the Richat structure could conceivably have been on the coast or near a major body of water during certain periods of the past. And this brings us to one of the most intriguing aspects of the theory, the African humid period, also known as the Green Sahara. From approximately 11,000 to 5,000 years ago, a period that overlaps with Plato's date for Atlantis if we adjust for possible exaggeration, the Sahara was not the hyper-arid desert we know today. It was a lush, green landscape dotted with lakes, rivers, and wetlands. It supported large populations of humans, as well as abundant wildlife, including elephants, hippos, crocodiles, and fish. Rock art from this period found across the Sahara depicts scenes of hunting, herding, swimming, and boating in a landscape utterly unlike the modern desert. If Atlantis existed during the Green Sahara period, the Richat structure could have been surrounded by water, perhaps connected to the Atlantic Ocean by rivers or inland seas. The catastrophe that destroyed Atlantis could have been not a volcanic eruption or an earthquake, but the desertification of the Sahara, a a gradual but ultimately devastating environmental change that transformed a fertile inhabited landscape into an uninhabitable wasteland. Proponents of the Richat theory also point to other details in Plato's account that seem to match. Plato mentions that Atlantis was rich in elephants, and the green Sahara certainly had elephants. He mentions mountains to the north of the Great Plain, and there are mountains to the north of the Richat structure. He mentions a great plain to the south of the city, and there are flat areas to the south of the Richat structure. The theory is creative, visually compelling, and aligns with real geological and climatological evidence in interesting ways. It has captured the imagination of many people who are drawn to the idea that Atlantis might be found in an unexpected place. But it also faces serious objections. Most critically, there is no archaeological evidence of any ancient civilization at the Richat structure. No ruins, no artifacts, no inscriptions, no tombs, no pottery, no tools, nothing that would indicate that a sophisticated urban civilization ever existed there. The formation is a natural geological feature, not a man-made structure. Its concentric rings are the result of differential erosion of rock layers, not human engineering. The dimensional match, while suggestive, is approximate at best and requires selective comparison. The location, while beyond the Pillars of Heracles in the broadest sense, is not in the Atlantic Ocean and does not match Plato's description of an island surrounded by sea. The desertification of the Sahara, while a real and dramatic environmental change, was a gradual process unfolding over thousands of years, not a sudden catastrophe occurring in a single day and a single night. Furthermore, the Green Sahara period, while contemporaneous with the broad timeframe suggested by Plato, does not align precisely. The Richat structure has been a geological feature for far longer than 12,000 years. Its formation dates back tens of millions of years. And the people who inhabited the Green Sahara, while culturally sophisticated in many ways, did not build the kind of monumental urban civilization described in the Critias. The Richat theory remains, at present, a fascinating speculation rather than a substantiated archaeological claim. But it has contributed something valuable to the Atlantis debate, a reminder that the search should not be limited to the ocean floor, and that dramatic environmental changes in the deep past may have transformed landscapes in ways we are only beginning to understand. Chapter 11, Atlantis in Spain, Tartessos and the Doñana Marshes. Another theory with deep roots and growing modern support places Atlantis not in the middle of the Atlantic, not in the Aegean and not in the Sahara, but in southern Spain, specifically in the region of Andalusia, near the mouth of the Guadalquivir River, in the area now occupied by the vast wetlands of the Doñana National Park. This theory connects the Atlantis legend to Tartessos, a semi-legendary civilization that flourished in southwestern Spain during the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age, roughly from 1100 to 550 BCE. Tartessos is mentioned by several ancient Greek writers, including Herodotus, who describes it as a wealthy kingdom ruled by a king named Arganthonios, a name that means silver-haired or silver-faced, who reigned for an improbably long time and was known for his wealth and generosity. The Greeks associated Tartessos with fabulous mineral wealth, particularly silver, tin, and copper metals that were essential for bronze production, and that made the Western Mediterranean a magnet for trade. The exact location of Tartessos has never been definitively established. Ancient sources place it near the Pillars of Heracles in the far west at the edge of the known world. Some scholars identify it with the city of Huelva in southwestern Spain. Others believe it was located further south, perhaps near the mouth of the Guadalquivir River or even beneath the modern city of Seville. Still others suggest it was not a single city but a cultural region, a confederation of settlements sharing a common culture and economy. The connection to Atlantis was first proposed in the modern era by the German archaeologist Adolf Scholten, who spent decades in the early 20th century searching for Tartessos in the marshes and dunes of the Doñana region. Schulten believed that Tartessos was the historical kernel behind Plato's Atlantis, a wealthy, powerful Western Mediterranean civilization that was destroyed by a catastrophe, perhaps a major tsunami or flood, and buried under the silt and sand of the Guadalquivir Delta. In more recent years, the theory has been taken up by a number of researchers, including the Spanish archaeologist Juan Valerias Robles and the head of the satellite application Catapult, among others. Using satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and traditional archaeological methods, several teams have identified what appear to be buried structures in the Doñana Marshes, rectangular shapes that some researchers interpret as the foundations of buildings or walls. In 2011, a team led by the University of Hartford's Richard Freund announced that they had found evidence of a large ancient settlement buried beneath the Doñana Marshes. Using satellite imagery and on-the-ground investigation, Freund and his colleagues identified what they believed were the remains of a large, multi-ring city, matching, they argued, Plato's description of the concentric rings of Atlantis. The announcement generated enormous media attention, but it was also met with skepticism from many archaeologists. Critics pointed out that the structures identified by satellite imagery could be natural features, the remnants of ancient lagoons, sand dunes, or channels in the ever-shifting landscape of the delta. Ground-penetrating radar results were ambiguous, and while some artifacts have been found in the Doñana area, they do not conclusively prove the existence of a large urban center. Nevertheless, the Tartessos Atlantis theory has several points in its favor. Tartessos was located near the Pillars of Heracles, exactly where Plato says Atlantis was located. It was a wealthy, powerful civilization known for its mineral resources and maritime trade. It flourished in the late Bronze Age and then apparently vanished. Its fate is one of the enduring mysteries of Mediterranean archaeology. The Doñana region has experienced dramatic geological changes over the millennia, with major tsunamis, flooding events, and shifts in the coastline that could have buried an ancient city under meters of mud and sand. A major tsunami is known to have struck the coast of southwestern Spain in historical times. The 1755 Lisbon earthquake generated a massive tsunami that devastated the coast of Portugal and southwestern Spain, and geological evidence suggests that similar events occurred in the deep past. If a Bronze Age tsunami had struck the coast near the mouth of the Guadalquivir, it could have destroyed a coastal city and buried it under debris. The theory also benefits from the broader archaeological context. The Western Mediterranean in the late Bronze Age was a dynamic and interconnected region. The Phoenicians established colonies along the coasts of Spain, North Africa, and the islands of the Western Mediterranean. The Greeks traded with Tartessos and other Western kingdoms. The region was rich in metals, silver, tin, copper, gold, that were essential for the economies of the Eastern Mediterranean civilizations. A powerful kingdom in this region, controlling access to these resources, would have been exactly the kind of entity that would attract attention, generate legends, and be remembered long after its disappearance. Whether Tartessos was actually the inspiration for Plato's Atlantis remains unproven. The archaeological evidence is tantalizing but incomplete. Further excavation in the Doñana region, difficult because of the protected status of the national park and the waterlogged nature of the terrain, may eventually provide answers. Chapter 12, the Black Sea and beyond, other candidates, the Atlantic, the Aegean, the Sahara, and southern Spain are far from the only locations proposed for Atlantis. Over the centuries, researchers have placed the lost civilization in virtually every corner of the globe. Let us survey some of the most notable alternative theories. The Black Sea One theory places Atlantis in the region of the Black Sea, connecting it to the dramatic flooding event that is believed to have occurred around 5600 BCE. According to the Black Sea Deluge hypothesis, proposed by geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman in 1997, the Black Sea was once a freshwater lake, smaller and lower than today, until rising Mediterranean waters broke through the Bosporus Strait and flooded the lake basin, raising its level by many meters and turning it into the saltwater sea we know today. This flooding, if it occurred as rapidly as Ryan and Pittman originally proposed, possibly over a period of months or years rather than millennia, would have been a catastrophic event for any communities living along the shores of the lake. It would have submerged vast areas of inhabited coastland, displaced thousands of people, and remained in the collective memory of the affected populations for generations. Some researchers have suggested that this event, or a similar flooding event elsewhere, might be the historical kernel behind both the Atlantis legend and the widespread flood myths found in cultures around the world, including the story of Noah's Ark in the Hebrew Bible, the story of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the story of Deucalion in Greek mythology. The Black Sea theory is interesting from a geological and mythological perspective, but it faces the same basic problem as the Minoan theory. The location does not match Plato's description. The Black Sea is east of Greece, not west, the opposite direction from the Pillars of Heracles. Antarctica, one of the more exotic theories, places Atlantis in Antarctica. This theory most prominently associated with the writers Rand and Rose Flem-Ath, who published When the Sky Fell in 1995, draws on the earlier work of Charles Hapgood, a college professor who proposed in the 1950s and 1960s that the Earth's crust periodically shifts, slipping over the mantle like the skin of an orange, causing dramatic and sudden changes in the positions of the continents relative to the poles. According to this theory, Antarctica was not always at the South Pole. Before the most recent crustal displacement, which Hapgood placed around 10,000 BCE, part of Antarctica extended into more temperate latitudes, free of ice and capable of supporting a civilization. This civilization was Atlantis. The crustal displacement moved Antarctica to its current polar position, burying the civilization under miles of ice and triggering the global cataclysms that Plato describes. The theory draws support from the famous Piri Reis map, a 1513 Ottoman map of the world that appears to show the coastline of Antarctica, centuries before Antarctica was officially discovered by European explorers. If the map does depict Antarctica, and this interpretation is highly contested, it could suggest that ancient map makers had knowledge of the southern continent before it was ice-covered. The Antarctica theory is imaginative, but it is contradicted by virtually everything we know about geology and climatology. The theory of crustal displacement as proposed by Hapgood is not accepted by mainstream geologists. Plate tectonics, the established framework for understanding the movement of the Earth's crust, accounts for the positions of the continents through slow, gradual processes operating over millions of years, not sudden catastrophic shifts. Antarctica has been at or near the South Pole for at least 15 million years, and it has been covered by ice sheets for far longer than the 12,000 years suggested by the Atlantis timeline. The Piri Reis map, while genuinely intriguing, is probably best explained as a compilation of earlier maps that may have depicted the southern coast of South America, extended and distorted through the map-making process, rather than an accurate depiction of an ice-free Antarctica. Indonesia and Southeast Asia are another theory proposed by the writer Aurelio Santos in his book Atlantis. The lost continent finally found places Atlantis in Indonesia. Santos argued that the Indonesian archipelago, particularly the area now covered by the South China Sea and the Java Sea, was once a vast, low-lying landmass that was flooded at the end of the last ice age as sea levels rose. This landmass, Santos claimed, was the original Atlantis. The theory has some geological basis. The Sunda Shelf, the shallow continental shelf that connects the islands of Borneo, Java, Sumatra, and the Malay Peninsula, was indeed above water during the last ice age, when sea levels were roughly 120 meters lower than today. It formed a vast landmass, sometimes called Sundaland, that was gradually flooded between roughly 14,000 and 6,000 years ago. Sundaland was inhabited. Stone tools, pottery, and other artifacts have been found on the now submerged shelf, and it is clear that significant human populations lived in this region before it was flooded. The flooding of Sunderland was a dramatic event in human prehistory, one of the largest losses of habitable land in the post-glacial period. But there are major problems with identifying Sunderland as Atlantis. The location is on the opposite side of the world from where Plato places Atlantis. There is no evidence of an advanced urban civilization on the Sunda shelf. The inhabitants appear to have been hunter-gatherers and early farmers, not the builders of golden temples and massive canal networks. And the flooding, while dramatic over geological timescales, was a gradual process, not a sudden catastrophe. The Iberian Peninsula, Malta, Sardinia, Cyprus, and more, the list of proposed locations for Atlantis is almost endless. Researchers have suggested the Iberian Peninsula, the coast of Morocco, the island of Malta, the island of Sardinia, the island of Cyprus, the coast of Ireland, the island of Britain, the coast of Sweden, the floor of the North Sea, the coast of Cuba, the Yucatan Peninsula, the coast of Brazil, the highlands of Bolivia, the mountains of Turkey, the plains of Iran, and many other places. Each theory has its advocates, its evidence, and its weaknesses. Each reflects not only the available evidence but also the cultural background, intellectual interests, and geographical location of the researcher. The German researcher tends to find Atlantis in the North Sea. The Spanish researcher tends to find it in Spain. The Greek researcher tends to find it in the Aegean. This is perhaps the most revealing thing about the Atlantis debate. The search for the lost civilization tells us as much about the searchers as it does about the searched for. Chapter 13, The Geological Evidence, What the Earth Remembers. Let us step back from the specific theories and examine what geology and earth science tell us about the plausibility of the Atlantis story in general. The key question is this: is it geologically possible for a large island or landmass to sink beneath the ocean in a relatively short period of time? The answer is complicated. On the one hand, the Earth is a dynamic planet. Continents move, oceans open and close, mountains rise and erode, coastlines advance and retreat. The geological record is full of dramatic events, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, tsunamis, landslides, flood events that have reshaped the surface of the planet and in some cases destroyed or submerged large areas of land. But these processes operate on very different timescales. The movement of continents, plate tectonics, is extremely slow, a few centimeters per year at most. The opening of the Atlantic Ocean, for example, has taken roughly 180 million years. On this timescale, the sinking of a large landmass in a single day and a single night is simply impossible. However, there are geological processes that can submerge land much more rapidly. Volcanic collapse is one such process. When a large volcanic island experiences a caldera-forming eruption, as happened at Thera around 1600 BCE and at Krakatoa in 1883, the collapse of the magma chamber can cause large portions of the island to sink into the resulting caldera. The 1883 eruption of Krakatoa destroyed most of the island, generating massive tsunamis that killed tens of thousands of people along the coasts of Java and Sumatra. A similar event in the deep past could have destroyed a volcanic island civilization. Seismic subsidence is another possibility. Major earthquakes can cause areas of land to sink by several meters, particularly in areas with soft, water-saturated sediments. The 1692 earthquake that struck Port Royal, Jamaica, then one of the largest and wealthiest cities in the Caribbean, caused large portions of the city to liquefy and sink into the harbor. Two-thirds of the city was submerged within minutes. The parallels to the Atlantis story are striking. Tsunamis can also devastate coastal civilizations, even if they do not literally sink the land beneath the sea. A massive tsunami striking a low-lying island or coastal city could destroy buildings, kill inhabitants, and deposit layers of sediment that would bury the ruins. To survivors watching from a distance, it might well appear that the city had sunk beneath the waves. Sea level change is perhaps the most important factor. As we have discussed, sea levels rose by approximately 120 meters between the peak of the last ice age, around 20,000 years ago, and the present day. This rise was not uniform or gradual. There were periods of rapid sea level rise known as meltwater pulses, when large quantities of glacial ice melted suddenly, causing sea levels to jump by several meters within a few centuries or even decades. The most dramatic of these events was Meltwater Pulse 1A, which occurred around 14,000 years ago and may have raised global sea levels by as much as 20 meters in less than 500 years, an average rate of roughly 4 centimeters per year, but possibly much faster during peak periods. If a civilization had been situated on low-lying coastal land during one of these meltwater pulses, it could have been flooded relatively rapidly, within a few generations, or even within a single lifetime. This is significant because Plato's date for the destruction of Atlantis, approximately 9600 BCE, falls within the general timeframe of post-glacial sea level rise. If a real civilization had existed on a coastal or island platform that was subsequently flooded, the date is at least broadly plausible from a geological standpoint. But there is a crucial caveat. Even the fastest meltwater pulses took centuries, not hours. A sea level rise of 4 centimeters per year is dramatic by geological standards, but it is slow enough that human populations would have had time to migrate. The land would have been gradually encroached upon, not suddenly swallowed. Plato's description of a catastrophe occurring in a single day and a single night does not match the pace of glacial melting. This means that if the Atlantis story has a geological basis, it is likely a composite, a blend of different types of events. Perhaps a gradual sea level rise submerged a coastal civilization over centuries, and this slow-motion catastrophe was later conflated with more dramatic events, earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, to produce the sudden, cataclysmic narrative that Plato records. Or perhaps the story is not about a single event at all, but about the general experience of post-glacial humanity, the experience of watching the sea rise year after year, generation after generation, consuming the coastal lands where the oldest and most prosperous settlements were located. This experience was universal in the ancient world. Every culture that lived near the sea witnessed the loss of land to rising waters. And virtually every culture has myths about great floods that destroyed earlier civilizations. Is Atlantis simply the Greek version of this universal story? A cultural memory of the post-glacial world, dressed up in Plato's philosophical language and embellished with details drawn from his knowledge of Mediterranean civilizations. It is possible. But the specificity of Plato's account, the names, the dates, the dimensions, the institutional details, argues against a simple interpretation. Whatever Atlantis is, it is more than a generic flood myth. It is a detailed description of a specific place, a specific people, and a specific catastrophe. And that specificity is what keeps the search alive. Chapter 14, Underwater Archaeology, Searching the Depths. The 20th and 21st centuries have brought powerful new tools to the search for Atlantis and for lost civilizations in general. Underwater archaeology, which emerged as a serious discipline in the mid-20th century with the development of scuba diving equipment and underwater cameras, has revealed an astonishing number of sunken cities, harbors, and structures around the world. These discoveries have demonstrated, beyond any doubt, that the sea has swallowed countless human settlements throughout history, and that the ruins of these settlements can survive underwater for thousands of years. The ancient port city of Dwarka in northwestern India is one striking example. Hindu texts describe Dwarka as the legendary kingdom of Lord Krishna, said to have been submerged by the sea after Krishna's departure from the earth. In the 1980s and 1990s, underwater archaeological investigations off the coast of modern Dwarka revealed the remains of a substantial ancient settlement, stone walls, anchors, and artifacts dating to various periods lying on the seabed. While the discoveries at Dwarka do not prove the literal truth of the Krishna legends, they demonstrate that an ancient city did exist at this location and that it was indeed submerged by the sea. The parallel to the Atlantis story is obvious. A legendary sunken city, described in ancient texts, confirmed to have a real archaeological counterpart beneath the waves. The Pavloptri archaeological site off the southern coast of mainland Greece is another remarkable example. Discovered in 1967, Pavloptri is one of the oldest known submerged cities in the world. It dates to the Bronze Age, roughly 3000 to 1100 BCE, and includes streets, buildings, tombs, and other structures, all lying in shallow water just a few meters deep. The city was submerged by a combination of tectonic subsidence and sea level change. Pavloptri is not Atlantis. It is a small, relatively modest settlement, nothing like the gleaming metropolis Plato describes, but it proves a crucial point. Bronze Age cities can be and were submerged by geological processes, and their remains can survive underwater for thousands of years. Other underwater discoveries have added to the picture. The sunken portions of the ancient Egyptian city of Heracleion, also known as Thanis, were discovered in 2000 by the French underwater archaeologist Frank Gaudio in the waters of Aboukir Bay, near Alexandria. Heracleion was a major trading port at the mouth of the Nile, mentioned by numerous ancient sources but lost for centuries, its location forgotten. The underwater excavations revealed an extraordinary array of artifacts, statues, inscriptions, shipwrecks, religious objects, and architectural remains, dating from the 7th century BCE to the 8th century CE. Heracleion was submerged by a combination of earthquakes, tsunamis, and the gradual subsidence of the unstable delta sediments on which it was built. Its rediscovery is one of the greatest achievements of underwater archaeology and a vivid reminder that the ancient world was far more extensive and interconnected than the surviving above-ground ruins suggest. The underwater ruins of Yonaguni, off the coast of Japan, have generated their own controversy. Discovered in 1987 by a local diver, the Yonaguni Monument is a massive underwater formation that features flat surfaces, right angles, steps, and what appear to be carved channels. Some researchers, most notably the marine geologist Masaki Kimura, have argued that the formation is a man-made structure, possibly the remains of an ancient civilization dating to the last ice age, when sea levels were much lower and the area was above water. Most geologists, however, believe that the Yonaguni Monument is a natural formation, the product of the natural fracturing and erosion of sandstone along bedding planes and joints. The debate continues, but the mainstream scientific consensus currently favors a natural explanation. Sonar and satellite technology have also revolutionized the search for underwater structures. Side-scan sonar, multi-beam bathymetry, and sub-bottom profiling can produce detailed images of the ocean floor, revealing features that would be invisible to divers. Satellite-derived bathymetry, using satellite altimetry to measure variations in the height of the ocean's surface, which reflect the topography of the underlying seabed, has provided comprehensive maps of the global ocean floor. These technologies have revealed the astonishing complexity of the underwater landscape, seamounts, ridges, canyons, plateaus, and other features that could, in some cases, be mistaken for man-made structures. The challenge for researchers is to distinguish between natural geological formations and genuine archaeological remains, a distinction that is often much more difficult underwater than on land. Despite the power of these tools, no confirmed remains of Atlantis have been found. The ocean floor has been extensively mapped, and no sunken continent or large island has been identified in the Atlantic or elsewhere. Individual structures, the Bimini Road, the Yonaguni Monument, various anomalies detected by sonar, remain controversial and are not accepted as evidence of a lost civilization by mainstream science. But the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The oceans are vast, and only a fraction of the seabed has been examined in detail. Structures buried under sediment might not show up on sonar, and the conditions that preserve ruins on land, dry climate, stable geology, are reversed underwater, where currents, biological activity, and sedimentation can obscure or destroy evidence over time. The search continues. Chapter 15, The Flood Myths, a Universal Memory. One of the most striking features of the Atlantis story is that it is, at its core, a flood myth, a story about the destruction of a civilization by water. And flood myths are found in cultures all over the world. The ancient Sumerians told the story of Ziusudra, a pious king who was warned by the gods of an impending deluge and built a great boat to save himself, his family, and the seed of all living things. The story appears in one of the oldest surviving literary texts in the world, dating to roughly 1600 BCE, but likely based on much earlier oral traditions. The Babylonians told the story of Utnapishtim, who appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the greatest works of ancient literature. In the story, the gods decide to destroy humanity with a flood, but the god warns Utnapishtim, who builds an ark and survives. After the flood, the gods grant Utnapishtim immortality. The Hebrew Bible tells the story of Noah, who is warned by God of a coming flood, builds an ark, and survives with his family and pairs of every animal species. The biblical flood story has obvious parallels to the Sumerian and Babylonian versions, and most scholars believe they share a common Mesopotamian origin. The ancient Greeks had their own flood myth, the story of Deucalion, son of Prometheus, who survived a great flood sent by Zeus to punish the wickedness of humanity. Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha escaped in a chest, and when the waters receded, they repopulated the earth by throwing stones over their shoulders, which turned into men and women. But the phenomenon extends far beyond the ancient Near East and Mediterranean. Flood myths are found in India, China, Southeast Asia, Australia, Polynesia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and among indigenous peoples across both continents of the Western Hemisphere. Some researchers have cataloged over 500 flood myths from cultures around the world. What are we to make of this remarkable convergence? There are several possible explanations. The most straightforward is that flood myths reflect local experiences of flooding. Rivers flood, coasts are struck by tsunamis. Heavy rains cause catastrophic deluges. In any culture that lives near water, which is to say, virtually every culture, the experience of devastating floods is universal. Flood myths may simply be the natural response to a common human experience. But some researchers have proposed a more dramatic explanation, that the global prevalence of flood myths reflects a shared memory of a real, global catastrophe, specifically, the rapid sea level rise that accompanied the end of the last ice age. As we have discussed, sea levels rose by approximately 120 meters between the glacial maximum and the present day. This rise flooded vast areas of coastal lowland around the world, the continental shelves, the land bridges, the river deltas where the earliest human settlements tended to be located. For tens of thousands of people over hundreds of generations, the experience of the sea encroaching on their homeland was a lived reality. Could the flood myths of the world be cultural memories of this experience, distilled, mythologized, and transmitted through countless generations of oral tradition? It is an appealing idea, but it faces significant challenges. The post-glacial sea level rise unfolded over thousands of years, far too slowly for any single generation to experience it as a sudden cataclysm. And the genetic diversity of flood myths, the vastly different details, characters, and narrative frameworks, argues against a single common origin. More likely, flood myths draw on multiple sources: local flooding events, post-glacial sea level rise, and the universal human experience of water as both life-giving and life-threatening. The Atlantis story may incorporate elements from all of these sources, filtered through Egyptian record-keeping, Greek philosophy, and Plato's own creative imagination. But the possibility remains that somewhere within this vast tapestry of flood mythology, within the common thread that runs through cultures separated by oceans and millennia, lies a genuine memory of events that science is only now beginning to reconstruct. Chapter 16. Plato's moral, the meaning beneath the mystery. We have spent a great deal of time searching for Atlantis, examining locations, evaluating evidence, weighing theories. But before we close this first part of our journey, let us return to the man who started it all and ask what he was really trying to tell us. Because whatever else Atlantis may be, a real place, a garbled memory, a geographical puzzle, it is also, and perhaps primarily, a moral story. And the moral is one that Plato clearly considered more important than the geography. The Atlantis story, as told in the Timaeus and Critias, is fundamentally about the relationship between power and virtue, between material wealth and moral excellence, between the external trappings of greatness and the inner qualities that make a society truly great. The early Atlanteans, blessed by their divine ancestry and the extraordinary resources of their island, are virtuous and wise. They possess great wealth, but they do not value it above virtue. They treat their possessions lightly, knowing that the abundance of goods increases through mutual friendship combined with virtue, while the eager pursuit of goods and the honoring of goods above virtue causes both goods and virtue to be lost. This is a recognizable Platonic idea, the conviction that the pursuit of material wealth for its own sake is corrosive to the soul, whether the soul of an individual or the soul of a state. Plato believed that the ideal society would be governed by philosopher kings who valued wisdom and justice above all else, and that societies decline when their leaders become focused on wealth, pleasure, and power. The decline of Atlantis follows this pattern precisely. As the divine bloodline thins and the mortal nature predominates, the Atlantean kings lose their virtue. They become greedy, arrogant, and unjust. They begin to value their wealth and power above the qualities that originally made them great. They appear glorious to the undiscerning eye, but to those who can see truly, they are diminished and corrupted. And then comes the punishment. Zeus gathers the gods and speaks, or begins to speak, before the text breaks off. The implication is clear: the gods will not tolerate the corruption of a once great civilization. Divine justice will be served, Atlantis will be destroyed. The contrast with Athens is equally instructive. The Athens of the Atlantis story is everything Atlantis is not. It is virtuous where Atlantis is corrupt. It is moderate where Atlantis is excessive. It fights for the freedom of others where Atlantis fights for domination. It is the ideal state in action, Plato's republic brought to life on the stage of history, and yet Athens too is destroyed. The same catastrophe that sinks Atlantis also swallows the Athenian army. Both civilizations are wiped from the earth, both are forgotten. Only the Egyptian records preserve their memory. What is Plato saying here? Perhaps that all human civilizations are temporary, that even the most virtuous society is vulnerable to the destructive forces of nature and the passage of time. Perhaps that the cycle of rise and fall is inevitable, and that the best we can do is to strive for virtue while we have the chance. Perhaps that the value of a great civilization lies not in its duration but in the qualities it embodies, and that those qualities, once lost, can never be recovered. These are sobering thoughts. They were sobering in Plato's time, when Athens had recently endured the catastrophe of the Peloponnesian War, the humiliation of defeat by Sparta, the tyranny of the 30, and the execution of Socrates. And they are sobering today when we face our own challenges, environmental, political, moral, that test the resilience and virtue of our civilizations. The Atlantis story, read in this light, is not just an ancient mystery to be solved. It is a mirror held up to every great society, at every moment in its history, asking the most fundamental question: are we living up to the best of what we could be? Or are we like the later Atlanteans, dazzled by our own wealth and power, blind to the corruption that is eating away at the foundations of our greatness? It is a question without a comfortable answer, and perhaps that is why the story endures. Chapter 17, The Cultural Legacy, Atlantis in Art, Literature, and Imagination. Before Plato's ink was dry, figuratively speaking, since he would have written on papyrus, the story of Atlantis began its long journey through human culture. Over the centuries, it has inspired an astonishing range of artistic, literary, and intellectual works, becoming one of the most recognizable and versatile myths in the world. In the centuries immediately following Plato, the story was primarily the province of philosophers, who debated its meaning and historicity in their commentaries and lectures. But as the classical world gave way to the medieval, and the medieval to the modern, Atlantis escaped the confines of philosophy and entered the broader cultural imagination. Francis Bacon, the great English philosopher and statesman, published his unfinished utopian novel, The New Atlantis, in 1627. In it, Bacon imagines a fictional island in the Pacific called Bensalem, which is home to a society devoted to scientific research and technological innovation. Bacon's Atlantis is not the lost civilization of Plato, but a vision of the future, a society built on the systematic pursuit of knowledge. The book was enormously influential in the development of the scientific revolution and the founding of scientific institutions like the Royal Society. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Atlantis became a popular subject for novels, poems, and plays. The Romantic poets, with their love of ruins, mysteries, and the sublime, were drawn to the image of a lost civilization beneath the sea. William Blake referenced Atlantis in his prophetic poems. The French writer Jules Verne included a visit to the underwater ruins of Atlantis in his 1870 novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, one of the most famous scenes in all of science fiction. Donnelly's 1882 book, as we have discussed, launched Atlantis into the mainstream of popular culture. In the 20th century, the legend became a fixture of pulp fiction, science fiction, fantasy, and adventure stories. Atlantis appeared in comic books, radio serials, films, and television shows. It became a setting for tales of super science, ancient astronauts, psychic powers, and hidden knowledge. The legend has also played a significant role in the New Age movement, which emerged in the late 20th century and drew heavily on theosophical ideas about lost civilizations and ancient wisdom. In New Age literature, Atlantis is often described as a civilization of crystal technology, telepathic communication, healing arts, and spiritual enlightenment, a golden age from which humanity has fallen and to which it may one day return. Edgar Cayce, the famous sleeping prophet of Virginia Beach, who gave thousands of psychic readings in the first half of the 20th century, spoke extensively about Atlantis. According to Cayce's readings, the Atlanteans possessed a powerful energy source based on large crystals, a firestone or terrible crystal, that they initially used for constructive purposes but eventually misused, leading to the destruction of their civilization. Cayce predicted that remnants of Atlantis would be found near Bimini in 1968 or 1969, a prediction that seemed to be confirmed by the discovery of the Bimini Road, though the archaeological significance of that formation remains disputed. In cinema, Atlantis has been the subject of numerous films, from the early silent era to modern blockbusters and animated features. The 1961 film Atlantis, The Lost Continent, the 2001 animated film Atlantis, The Lost Empire, and the 2018 superhero film Aquaman, which reimagines Atlantis as an underwater kingdom, are just a few examples. Each film reflects the cultural moment in which it was made, using the Atlantis legend as a canvas for exploring contemporary themes and anxieties. In video games, Atlantis has been a popular setting and plot element, appearing in titles ranging from the Tomb Raider series to Assassin's Creed, Odyssey. The interactive nature of video games allows players to explore imagined reconstructions of the lost city, to walk its streets, solve its puzzles, and experience its catastrophe firsthand. The cultural legacy of Atlantis is vast and varied, encompassing philosophy, science fiction, occultism, archaeology, nationalism, environmentalism, and pure entertainment. The legend has proved infinitely adaptable, capable of being reshaped to serve almost any purpose, and this adaptability is perhaps the deepest clue to its enduring power. Atlantis endures not because we know what it was, but precisely because we do not. The mystery is the message. The unknown is the attraction. As long as the question remains unanswered, as long as the lost city remains lost, it will continue to fascinate, to inspire, and to haunt the human imagination. Chapter 18. The Science of Lost Civilizations. In recent decades, a growing body of scientific evidence has suggested that human civilization may be older and more complex than previously believed. and this evidence has given new energy to the search for Atlantis and other lost civilizations. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey is perhaps the most dramatic example. Excavated beginning in 1995 by the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, Göbekli Tepe is a monumental stone complex dating to approximately 9600 BCE, the very date that Plato assigns to the destruction of Atlantis. The site features massive T-shaped stone pillars, arranged in circles, carved with elaborate reliefs of animals, lions, foxes, scorpions, vultures, and other creatures. Some of the pillars weigh over 10 tons. Göbekli Tepe was built by hunter-gatherers, people who had not yet developed agriculture, pottery, or metal tools. Its construction required a level of social organization, labor coordination, and architectural knowledge that was previously thought impossible for pre-agricultural societies. The discovery forced archaeologists to fundamentally revise their models of how and when complex societies emerged. Göbekli Tepe is not Atlantis. It is a ritual site, not a city. It is located in Anatolia, not in the Atlantic. And it was built by hunter-gatherers, not by a sophisticated maritime civilization. But its existence proves a crucial point, that human societies were capable of remarkable achievements far earlier than previously believed, and that our knowledge of the deep past is far less complete than we once assumed. Other recent discoveries have reinforced this point. The underwater ruins at Dwarka, the megalithic temples of Malta, which date to before 3600 BCE, making them older than the Egyptian pyramids, the enigmatic stone structures of the Bok Saga traditions in Finland, the massive stone walls of Sacsayhuaman in Peru, whose precisely fitted blocks weigh hundreds of tons. All these suggest that the deep human past was richer, more complex, and more surprising than the standard historical narrative allows. The idea that there may have been advanced civilizations in the deep past, perhaps predating the established timeline of human civilization by thousands of years, is no longer as fringe as it once was. While mainstream archaeologists remain cautious, a growing number of researchers are open to the possibility that the conventional timeline is incomplete and that significant chapters of human history remain to be discovered. This does not mean that Atlantis, as described by Plato, existed. The specific claims of the Timaeus and Critias, a continent-sized island, a city of golden temples, an empire that dominated the Mediterranean, a cataclysm that sank it in a day, remain unverified and by the standards of current evidence, unverifiable. But it does mean that the question cannot be dismissed out of hand. If Göbekli Tepe can exist, 12,000 years old and built by hunter-gatherers, then what else might be out there, waiting to be found, buried under desert sands, hidden beneath ocean waves, or concealed under meters of accumulated sediment? The search for Atlantis is in this sense part of a larger and more profound search, a search for the lost chapters of human history, for the full story of who we are and where we came from. Closing of Part 1, the mystery endures, and so we come to the end of the first part of our journey. We have traveled from the streets of ancient Athens to the temple halls of Egypt, from the volcanic furnace of Thera to the concentric rings of the Saharan Eye, from the muddy marshes of southern Spain to the frozen wastes of Antarctica. We have listened to Plato's words and debated their meaning. We have examined the geological record, explored underwater ruins, and surveyed the vast cultural legacy of the Atlantis legend. And yet the mystery endures. We do not know whether Atlantis was real. We do not know whether Plato was recording history, transmitting legend, or inventing fiction. We do not know whether the concentric rings of the capital city, the golden temple of Poseidon, the ritual of the bull, and the cataclysm of fire and water reflect genuine memories of a lost civilization or the philosophical imagination of one of history's greatest minds. What we do know is this: the question will not go away. Every generation asks it anew. Every new discovery in archaeology, geology, or oceanography reopens the debate. Every advance in technology brings new tools to bear on the search. and every retelling of the story in books, films, games, and documentaries like this one introduces the mystery to new audiences who find themselves captivated, just as audiences have been captivated for 23 centuries. Atlantis endures because it speaks to something deep in the human spirit, a longing for lost greatness, a fascination with the fragility of civilization, a hunger to know the full story of our past. It is a mirror in which we see our own hopes and fears reflected. It is a question that, answered or unanswered, illuminates the most fundamental truths about who we are. We go deeper. We push beyond the familiar theories into territory that is stranger, more challenging, and more thought-provoking. We examine the evidence that mainstream science has overlooked or dismissed, and we ask whether that dismissal was justified. We explore the enigma of ancient maps that seem to depict lands no one should have known about. We investigate the mystery of megalithic structures around the world that defy easy explanation. We confront the radical hypothesis that human civilization is far older than the textbooks say. We hear from the skeptics, who insist that Atlantis is nothing more than a philosopher's fable, and from the researchers who believe the evidence is pointing toward a revolution in our understanding of the past. And in the end, we face the deepest question of all, not merely where Atlantis was or whether it existed, but what the search itself reveals about humanity's relationship with its own history, its own fragility, and its own unquenchable desire to know. This is the conclusion of Atlantis, the mysterious hidden world. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it. And be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. Chapter 19, The Mystery of Ancient Maps, one of the most tantalizing threads in the Atlantis mystery, involves a collection of ancient and medieval maps that appear to depict geographical knowledge far beyond what their makers should have possessed. These maps have been cited by researchers as evidence that an advanced seafaring civilization, perhaps Atlantis itself, once explored and charted the world, and that fragments of their knowledge survived, copied and recopied by later civilizations that did not fully understand what they were preserving. The most famous of these maps is the Piri Reis map, which we briefly mentioned in Part 1. Created in 1513 by the Ottoman admiral and cartographer Piri Reis, the map is drawn on a piece of gazelle skin and shows the western coast of Africa, the eastern coast of South America, and most controversially, what appears to be the northern coastline of Antarctica. The map is annotated by Piri Reis himself, who explains that he compiled it from approximately 20 older source maps, some of which dated back to the time of Alexander the Great, the 4th century BCE. He also states that some of his sources were maps used by Christopher Columbus and other contemporary navigators. The controversy centers on the southern portion of the map. If the landmass depicted at the bottom of the map is indeed Antarctica, and this identification is disputed, then it appears to show the continent's coastline as it would appear without its ice sheet. Since Antarctica has been covered by ice for at least several million years, and since the continent was not officially discovered until 1820, the map would seem to preserve knowledge from an impossibly distant past. This interpretation was most famously championed by Charles Hapgood, the professor whose theory of crustal displacement we discussed in Part 1. In his 1966 book Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, Hapgood argued that the Piri Reis map and several other anomalous maps were evidence that an advanced civilization had mapped the Earth in remote antiquity, before the last ice age, when Antarctica was ice-free, and that their cartographic knowledge had been transmitted in degraded form through millennia of copying and compilation. Hapgood's work attracted the attention of Albert Einstein, who wrote a foreword to an earlier book by Hapgood, praising the originality of his thinking while carefully noting that the evidence was not yet conclusive. Einstein's endorsement gave Hapgood's ideas a veneer of scientific respectability, though mainstream geologists and historians have remained skeptical. The objections to Hapgood's interpretation are substantial. First, the identification of the southern landmass as Antarctica is far from certain. Many cartographic historians argue that the landmass is actually a distorted depiction of the South American coast, bent southward and eastward to fit the available space on the map. Map makers of the early 16th century routinely distorted coastlines, compressed distances, and filled in unknown areas with speculative geography. The apparent resemblance to Antarctica may be coincidental. Second, even if the map does depict something resembling Antarctica, this does not necessarily require an Ice Age source. Renaissance mapmakers were influenced by the ancient Greek theory of a great southern continent, the Terra Australis Incognita, which was believed, on theoretical grounds, to balance the known landmasses of the northern hemisphere. Many 16th century maps include a hypothetical southern continent that does not correspond to any real place. The southern portion of the Piri Rise map may simply be a version of this speculative tradition. Third, Hapgood's broader theory of crustal displacement, the mechanism by which he explained how Antarctica could have been ice-free within human history, is not supported by modern geology. As we discussed, plate tectonics accounts for the positions of the continents through slow, gradual processes, and Antarctica has been at or near the South Pole for tens of millions of years. Nevertheless, the Piri Rise map remains genuinely intriguing. Its accuracy in depicting the coastlines of South America and Africa, particularly given the state of European geographical knowledge in 1513, is impressive. And Piri Rise's own statement that he drew on very old source maps raises the question of where those sources came from and how far back they ultimately go. The Piri Rise map is not the only anomalous map that has attracted attention. The Orontius Phineus map of 1531 appears to show Antarctica with its major features, mountain ranges, river systems, and a central landmass largely free of ice. The Philippe Buech map of 1737 appears to depict Antarctica as two separate landmasses, separated by a waterway, a detail that was not confirmed by modern science until seismic surveys in the 20th century revealed that the Antarctic ice sheet covers two distinct geological regions, East Antarctica and West Antarctica, separated by a deep subglacial trench. The Zeno map of 1380, published in 1558 but allegedly based on voyages in the late 14th century, shows details of the North Atlantic, including Iceland and Greenland, with a degree of accuracy that has puzzled researchers. The Haji Ahmed map of 1559 depicts the western coast of North America with what some researchers consider surprising accuracy, including details of Alaska and the land bridge that once connected Asia and the Western Hemisphere, a land bridge that was submerged by rising sea levels thousands of years before any known cartographic tradition. Each of these maps has been studied, debated, and argued over by historians, cartographers, and Atlantis researchers. The mainstream view is that their apparent anomalies can be explained by the normal processes of Renaissance map-making, compilation from multiple sources, speculative geography, and coincidental resemblances to real features. The alternative view is that they preserve fragments of a much older cartographic tradition, a tradition that originated with a lost civilization capable of global seafaring. The truth may lie somewhere in between. It is clear that the history of human exploration and navigation is longer and more complex than the standard narrative allows. Recent archaeological discoveries, including evidence of long-distance seafaring in Southeast Asia dating back at least 65,000 years, and evidence of Polynesian navigation across the vast Pacific using sophisticated techniques of stellar and wave pattern reading, have demonstrated that ancient peoples were far more capable mariners than was once believed. Whether this implies the existence of a single, advanced, pre-Ice Age civilization that mapped the entire globe, as Hapgood and his followers suggest, is another question entirely. The evidence is suggestive but far from conclusive. The ancient maps remain enigmatic, tantalizing fragments that seem to point toward lost knowledge, but that refuse to yield their secrets completely. Chapter 20, Megalithic Mysteries, SDONES, that should not exist across every continent on Earth. There stand monuments of stone, massive, enigmatic, and in many cases seemingly impossible. They are the megaliths, the great stones of the ancient world, and they have played a central role in the search for Atlantis and for lost civilizations in general. Consider the Great Pyramid of Giza. Built around 2560 BCE as a tomb for the pharaoh Khufu, the Great Pyramid is one of the most precisely engineered structures in human history. It contains an estimated 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing an average of 2.5 tons, with some blocks in the interior chambers weighing as much as 80 tons. The base of the pyramid is leveled to within just 2.1 centimeters across its entire 230-meter length, an extraordinary feat of surveying and construction that would be impressive even with modern technology. The pyramid is aligned to true north with an accuracy of less than 1/15 of a degree. Its proportions encode mathematical relationships, including an approximation of the mathematical constant pi, that have fascinated researchers for centuries. The sheer scale of the project, involving the quarrying, transport, and precise placement of millions of tons of stone, required a level of organizational sophistication, engineering knowledge, and labor coordination that pushes the limits of what we believe was possible in the 3rd millennium BCE. And the Great Pyramid is only the most famous of the world's megalithic monuments. Consider some others. Baalbek in modern Lebanon is the site of a massive Roman temple complex, the Temple of Jupiter Heliopolis, that rests on a platform of enormous stone blocks. 3 of these blocks, known as the trilithon, are among the largest cut stones in the world, each weighing approximately 800 tons. A 4th block, known as the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, still lies in a nearby quarry and weighs an estimated 1,000 tons. A 5th block, discovered in 2014 beneath the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, weighs an estimated 1,650 tons, possibly the largest stone block ever quarried by human hands. How are these stones moved? Even with modern heavy lifting equipment, moving a 1,000-ton stone block would be an extraordinary engineering challenge. The Romans, who built the temple on top of the platform, did not possess the technology to quarry or move stones of this size. This has led many researchers to conclude that the massive foundation stones predate the Roman construction, that they were placed there by an earlier, unknown civilization. Mainstream archaeologists generally attribute the trilithon and the related megaliths to Hellenistic or Roman-era engineering, arguing that the ancient builders used ramps, rollers, levers, and large numbers of laborers to move the stones. But the precise methods remain debated, and the sheer scale of the blocks continues to provoke wonder and speculation. Sacsayhuaman, the great fortress above the city of Cusco in Peru, presents a similar mystery. Its walls are constructed of enormous limestone blocks, some weighing over 100 tons, that are fitted together with such precision that a knife blade cannot be inserted between them. The blocks are not rectangular but polygonal, with complex interlocking shapes that resist earthquake damage. The Inca, who are traditionally credited with building Sacsayhuaman, did not use mortar, metal tools, or the wheel. How they achieved this level of precision remains one of the great unsolved puzzles of archaeology. Pumapunku, near the shores of Lake Titicaca in Bolivia, is an even more enigmatic site. Part of the larger Tiwanaku complex, Pumapunku features precisely cut stone blocks, some made of andesite, one of the hardest stones in the world, with flat surfaces, right angles, and complex interlocking channels that appear to have been machined rather than hand-carved. Some blocks weigh over 100 tons and were transported from quarries more than 90 kilometers away. The site dates to approximately 500 to 600 CE, though some researchers have argued for a much earlier date. The precision of the stonework at Pumapunku has led some researchers to suggest that the builders possessed technology far beyond what is conventionally attributed to pre-Columbian South American cultures. The flat surfaces are so smooth, the angles so precise, and the channels so uniform that they seem to demand explanations involving advanced tools or techniques that have been lost. On the island of Malta, The megalithic temples of Hagar Kim, Najdra, and the hypogeum of Hal Saflieni date to between approximately 3600 and 2500 BCE, making them older than the Great Pyramid and older than Stonehenge. These temples are built of enormous limestone blocks, some weighing over 20 tons, and feature elaborate architectural details including corbelled ceilings, carved decorations, and precisely oriented doorways that align with the solstices and equinoxes. The builders of the Maltese temples left no written records, and their identity is unknown. The civilization that created them apparently flourished for over a millennium and then vanished, replaced by a culturally distinct population. The temples remain massive, silent, and unexplained. Stonehenge on Salisbury Plain in England is perhaps the most iconic megalithic monument in the world. Built in stages over approximately 1,500 years, from roughly 3,000 to 1,500 BCE, it features a ring of massive sarsen stones, each weighing about 25 tons, topped by horizontal lintels, surrounding an inner ring of smaller bluestones that were transported from quarries in Wales over 200 kilometers away. The site is aligned with the midsummer sunrise and the midwinter sunset, indicating a sophisticated understanding of astronomy. Recent discoveries have added to the mystery of Stonehenge. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have revealed the remains of dozens of previously unknown monuments, barrows, and earthworks in the surrounding landscape, suggesting that Stonehenge was not an isolated structure, but the centerpiece of a vast ritual complex covering hundreds of square kilometers. The nearby site of Durrington Walls, excavated in the 2000s, appears to have been a large settlement, perhaps a gathering place for the thousands of workers and pilgrims who participated in the construction and rituals of Stonehenge. What connects all these megalithic sites? Why do we find massive, precisely engineered stone structures on virtually every continent, spanning thousands of years of history? Is there a common thread, a shared tradition of monumental stone construction that links the pyramids of Egypt to the temples of Malta, the walls of Sacsayhuaman to the circles of Stonehenge? Most mainstream archaeologists would say no. They would argue that megalithic construction arose independently in different parts of the world at different times in response to local conditions and cultural traditions. The desire to build massive, enduring monuments is a universal human impulse, not the signature of a single lost civilization. But a minority of researchers, including some who are deeply knowledgeable and serious, have argued that the similarities are too numerous and too specific to be explained by independent invention alone. They point to common features: the use of enormous stones quarried and transported over great distances, the precision of the stonework, the astronomical alignments, the polygonal masonry techniques, and the fact that many of these sites are associated with legends of an earlier, more advanced civilization that taught the local people how to build. Could these monuments be the legacy of Atlantis, or of a civilization like Atlantis that flourished in the deep past and spread its knowledge around the world before being destroyed? It is a seductive idea, but it remains, for now, an idea without definitive proof. The megalithic monuments of the world are genuinely mysterious, and our explanations for how they were built are often incomplete. But the gap between "we don't fully understand how this was built" and "it must have been built by a lost super-civilization" is enormous, and it should not be bridged by speculation alone. What the megaliths do tell us, however, is that ancient peoples were far more capable, more organized, and more knowledgeable than we have often given them credit for, and that is a truth worth remembering as we continue our search. Chapter 21, The Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis. In 2007, a team of scientists led by Richard Firestone of Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory published a paper that proposed a radical new theory about the end of the last ice age, a theory that, if correct, would have profound implications for the search for Atlantis. The theory is known as the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, and it centers on a mysterious climatic event that occurred approximately 12,800 years ago. To understand the hypothesis, we must first understand the Younger Dryas itself. The Younger Dryas was a period of sudden, dramatic cooling that interrupted the general warming trend at the end of the last ice age. After thousands of years of gradual warming, during which glaciers were retreating, sea levels were rising, and the Earth was transitioning from an ice age to the warmer climate of the present era, the warming abruptly stopped. Temperatures plummeted, glaciers advanced again. The climate reverted to near glacial conditions, particularly in the northern hemisphere. This cold period lasted approximately 1,200 years, from roughly 12,800 to 11,600 years ago, before ending as abruptly as it had begun. The onset was remarkably rapid. Some evidence suggests that temperatures dropped by several degrees within a matter of decades, or possibly even years. The Younger Dryas was a catastrophe for the living world. In North America, it coincided with the extinction of the megafauna, the large Ice Age animals that had roamed the continent for hundreds of thousands of years. Mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, dire wolves, and dozens of other species vanished within a geologically short period. The Clovis culture, the most widespread and distinctive culture of early human inhabitants of North America, also disappeared, replaced by different cultural traditions. What caused the Younger Dryas? The traditional explanation involves disruptions to ocean circulation patterns. As the great ice sheets over North America melted, they released vast quantities of freshwater into the North Atlantic, possibly through a catastrophic drainage of glacial Lake Agassiz, an enormous body of meltwater that covered much of central Canada. This freshwater influx, the theory goes, disrupted the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the system of ocean currents, including the Gulf Stream, that distributes heat from the tropics to the high latitudes, causing a rapid cooling of the northern hemisphere. This explanation is well supported and widely accepted, but the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes an additional, more dramatic cause. Firestone and his colleagues argued that the onset of the Younger Dryas was triggered by the impact of a large comet or asteroid, or possibly by the airburst of a fragmenting comet over the North American ice sheet. The impact, they proposed, would have generated enormous heat and blast energy, causing widespread wildfires, melting large portions of the ice sheet, destabilizing ocean currents, and injecting dust and soot into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and triggering the Younger Dryas cooling. The evidence cited by the proponents of the hypothesis includes a widespread layer of unusual materials, including nanodiamonds, magnetic microspherules, melt glass, and elevated levels of platinum and iridium, found in sediments dating to the onset of the Younger Dryas at sites across North America, Europe, and the Middle East. These materials, the researchers argue, are consistent with a cosmic impact and cannot be explained by volcanism, human activity, or other known terrestrial processes. The hypothesis has been fiercely debated since its publication. Some researchers have confirmed the presence of the unusual materials and offered additional evidence in support of the impact scenario. Others have challenged the methodology, disputed the identification of the materials, and argued that the evidence does not require an impact explanation. In 2018, a major study published in the journal Scientific Reports reported the discovery of a large impact crater beneath the Hiawatha Glacier in northwestern Greenland. The crater, approximately 31 kilometers in diameter, was identified using airborne radar surveys and appears to have been caused by the impact of a kilometer-wide iron meteorite. The age of the crater is still being determined, but initial estimates suggested it could date to the Younger Dryas period, making it a potential candidate for the Younger Dryas impactor. Subsequent analysis, however, has suggested that the Hiawatha crater may be significantly older than the Younger Dryas, possibly several million years old. The question remains open. What does any of this have to do with Atlantis? The connection is both simple and profound. If a major cosmic impact struck the Earth approximately 12,800 years ago, triggering fires, floods, climate change, and mass extinctions, it would have been exactly the kind of catastrophe that could have destroyed a coastal civilization and erased it from the geological and archaeological record. Plato's date for the destruction of Atlantis, approximately 9600 BCE, falls within the general timeframe of the younger Dryas onset. The description of earthquakes, floods, and the submersion of an entire landmass is consistent with the kind of devastation that a major impact event could cause, particularly if the impact hit an ice sheet, generating massive floods of meltwater, enormous tsunamis, and rapid sea level rise. Graham Hancock, the British journalist and author whose work we will discuss in more detail shortly, has been one of the most prominent advocates of the idea that the younger Dryas impact destroyed an advanced Ice Age civilization, the historical kernel, he suggests, behind the Atlantis legend. Hancock argues that the evidence of an advanced pre-Ice Age civilization has been largely erased by the catastrophes of the younger Dryas period, the fires, the floods, the climate change, and the millennia of geological transformation that followed. He suggests that the survivors of this catastrophe scattered across the globe, carrying with them fragments of their knowledge, and that this knowledge seeded the seemingly sudden emergence of complex civilizations in places like Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and Mesoamerica thousands of years later. This is a provocative and controversial thesis. Mainstream archaeologists have criticized it for being speculative, for relying on circumstantial evidence, and for underestimating the capacity of indigenous peoples to develop complex civilizations on their own. The younger Dryas impact hypothesis itself, while the subject of legitimate scientific investigation, has not yet achieved consensus acceptance. But the questions raised by the younger Dryas are real and important. Something dramatic happened to the Earth approximately 12,800 years ago. The climate changed, species went extinct, cultures disappeared, and the cause or causes are still not fully understood. Whether the answer lies in a cosmic impact, in ocean circulation changes, in some combination of these and other factors, or in something we have not yet imagined, the younger Dryas remains one of the most significant unsolved puzzles of Earth science. And it provides a plausible, if unproven, framework for understanding how a civilization could have been lost so completely that only legend remains. Chapter 22, Graham Hancock and the Lost Civilization. No discussion of the modern Atlantis debate would be complete without considering the work of Graham Hancock, the British writer and researcher who has done more than perhaps any other individual in the past 3 decades to popularize the idea that a technologically sophisticated civilization existed before the end of the last ice age and was destroyed by a global catastrophe. Hancock's 1995 book Fingerprints of the Gods became an international bestseller, reaching millions of readers and sparking a worldwide conversation about the possibility of a lost civilization. In it, Hancock draws on a wide range of evidence, ancient maps, megalithic monuments, astronomical alignments, mythology, and geology, to argue that an advanced civilization flourished during the Ice Age, was destroyed by the cataclysms that marked the end of the Pleistocene, and bequeathed its knowledge to the cultures that emerged in its wake. Hancock does not specifically identify this lost civilization as Atlantis. He is careful to note that we do not know what its people called themselves or where exactly they were based. But the parallels to Plato's account are obvious and deliberate. Hancock's lost civilization, like Atlantis, was a maritime culture that mapped the world, built monumental structures, possessed advanced knowledge of astronomy and mathematics, and was destroyed by a sudden catastrophe involving earthquakes and floods. In subsequent books, including Underworld, The Mysterious Origins of Civilization, 2002, Magicians of the Gods, 2015, and America Before 2019, Hancock has expanded and refined his argument, incorporating new evidence and responding to critics. He has investigated underwater structures off the coasts of India, Japan, and the Mediterranean. He has studied the astronomical alignments of ancient monuments, including the Sphinx and the pyramids of Giza, which he argues may be far older than their conventionally assigned dates. He has championed the younger Dryas impact hypothesis as the mechanism that destroyed his proposed lost civilization. One of Hancock's most influential arguments concerns the Sphinx. The Great Sphinx of Giza, a monumental limestone statue with the body of a lion and the head of a human, is conventionally dated to the reign of the pharaoh Khafre, around 2500 BCE. But in the early 1990s, the geologist Robert Schoch of Boston University argued, based on an analysis of the weathering patterns on the Sphinx and its enclosure, that the monument shows evidence of prolonged rainfall erosion, a type of weathering that would require thousands of years of heavy precipitation. Since the Sahara has been hyper-arid for roughly 5,000 years, Schoch argued, the rainfall erosion must date to a much earlier period, possibly to the African humid period, which ended around 5000 BCE or even earlier. This would make the Sphinx thousands of years older than its conventional date, and would imply the existence of a civilization capable of monumental construction at a time when, according to conventional history, only simple hunter-gatherer and early agricultural societies existed in the region. Schoch's water erosion hypothesis has been debated extensively. Some geologists have supported his analysis, others have proposed alternative explanations for the weathering patterns, including salt crystallization, chemical weathering, and subsurface water seepage. The question remains unresolved, and the conventional date for the Sphinx has not been officially revised. Hancock has also drawn attention to the astronomical alignments of the Giza pyramid complex. Working with the engineer Robert Bovell, who proposed the Orion correlation theory in 1989, Hancock has argued that the three Great Pyramids of Giza are arranged to mirror the pattern of the three stars in the belt of Orion, and that this alignment was most precise not in 2500 BCE, but around 10,500 BCE, when the constellation of Leo, the lion, would have risen due east, directly in the gaze of the Sphinx. If correct, this would suggest that the Giza complex was originally planned, if not actually built, around 10,500 BCE, roughly contemporaneous with Plato's date for Atlantis. The pyramids in this interpretation are not merely tombs but astronomical markers, encoding knowledge of the sky that dates back to the very dawn of the post-Ice Age world. The Orion correlation theory has been criticized by astronomers and Egyptologists on multiple grounds. The match between the pyramids and the belt of Orion is approximate rather than precise. The theory requires the selection of a specific date from a range of possible dates, and the conventional archaeological evidence firmly supports a construction date in the 3rd millennium BCE for all three pyramids. Hancock's work, taken as a whole, presents a vision of the human past that is dramatically different from the mainstream archaeological narrative. In his view, civilization did not begin around 3500 BCE in Mesopotamia and Egypt, as the textbooks say. It began much earlier, perhaps as early as 12,000 years ago or more, with a sophisticated culture that was destroyed by cosmic catastrophe and whose survivors became the teachers and civilizers of later peoples. It is a compelling vision. It draws on real evidence, raises legitimate questions, and challenges assumptions that deserve to be challenged. But it also relies heavily on inference, speculation, and the selective use of evidence. The gaps between the data points are enormous, and much of the structure of the argument is held together by imagination rather than proof. Mainstream archaeologists have been critical, often harshly so, of Hancock's work. They argue that he cherry-picks evidence, ignores contradictory data, and constructs elaborate theories on foundations that are far too thin to support them. They point out that the apparently sudden emergence of complex civilizations in the 4th millennium BCE is not actually so sudden when examined in detail. that the development of agriculture, pottery, metallurgy, writing, and urban organization can be traced through a long, gradual archaeological sequence that does not require a lost civilizing source. These criticisms have merit, but so do some of Hancock's questions. Why does Göbekli Tepe exist? How were the largest megaliths quarried and moved? Why do flood myths and legends of culture-bearing strangers appear in so many unconnected cultures? Why do some ancient structures seem to encode astronomical knowledge that their conventionally dated builders should not have possessed? These questions do not prove the existence of a lost civilization. But they do suggest that our understanding of the deep past is incomplete, and that humility, not certainty, should characterize our approach to the mysteries of human origins. Chapter 23. The skeptics speak. It would be intellectually dishonest to present the Atlantis mystery without giving full voice to the skeptics, the scholars, scientists, and critical thinkers who have examined the evidence and concluded that Atlantis, as described by Plato, never existed. Their arguments are powerful and they deserve to be heard. The most fundamental skeptical argument is the simplest. There is no physical evidence for Atlantis. No ruins, no artifacts, no inscriptions, no genetic markers, no confirmed underwater structures, nothing that can be definitively linked to the civilization described in the Timaeus and Critias. In over 2,000 years of searching, involving thousands of researchers and increasingly powerful technology, not a single piece of conclusive evidence has been found. This is a significant fact. Consider the contrast with other ancient civilizations that were once thought to be mythical. Troy was discovered by Heinrich Schliemann in the 1870s. The Hittite Empire, once known only from biblical and Egyptian references, was confirmed by archaeological excavations in Anatolia in the early 20th century. The Minoan civilization was uncovered by Arthur Evans at Knossos beginning in 1900. In each case, systematic excavation produced abundant physical evidence, buildings, artifacts, inscriptions, burial sites that confirmed the existence of the civilization in question. Atlantis has produced nothing comparable. Despite exhaustive searches in the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, and elsewhere, no archaeological site has been identified that matches Plato's description. The Bimini Road, the Richat structure, the Doñana Marshes, and the various underwater anomalies remain controversial and unconfirmed. The skeptics also emphasize the literary and philosophical context of Plato's account. As we discussed in Part 1, the Atlantis story appears in philosophical dialogues whose primary purpose is to explore questions of justice, virtue, and the ideal state, not to record history. Plato was a master storyteller who regularly used invented narratives to illustrate philosophical points. The Atlantis story, the skeptics argue, is simply another such narrative, more elaborate and detailed than most, but fictional nonetheless. The chain of transmission that Plato describes from Egyptian priests to Solon to Critias to Plato is, the skeptics note, a standard literary device of the ancient world. Ancient writers frequently attributed their stories to distant, authoritative sources to enhance their credibility. The claim that a story comes from ancient Egyptian records or the oldest and wisest priests is not evidence of historicity, it is evidence of skillful storytelling. The skeptics also point out that many of the matches between Plato's description and proposed locations are the result of selective reading and confirmation bias. Researchers who want to find Atlantis in a particular location tend to emphasize the details that match and downplay or explain away the details that do not. The Richat structure, for example, has concentric rings, but no evidence of habitation, no canal to the sea, no golden temples, and no surrounding ocean. Minoan Crete had bull rituals and a maritime empire, but it was in the Aegean, not the Atlantic, and it did not sink beneath the sea. This selective approach, the skeptics argue, can make almost any ancient site or civilization match Plato's description if you try hard enough. And the fact that dozens of mutually exclusive locations have been proposed for Atlantis, each with its own set of matches, is itself evidence that the matching process is unreliable. The philosopher and skeptic Michael Shermer has compared the search for Atlantis to the phenomenon of pareidolia, the human tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random data. Just as we see faces in clouds, animals in constellations, and human figures in rock formations, we see Atlantis in geological structures, underwater anomalies, and cultural parallels that may have no connection to Plato's story at all. The historian and classical scholar Pierre Vidal-Naquet, in his book Atlantis, Story of a Dream, offered a detailed analysis of the Atlantis account as a philosophical and literary construction. Vidal-Naquet argued that every element of the story, the geography, the political structure, the military organization, the moral decline, can be traced to Plato's own philosophical ideas, his knowledge of existing civilizations, particularly Persia, Athens, and Egypt, and his literary techniques. There is no need, Vidal-Naquet concluded, to posit a real Atlantis behind the text. The text explains itself. The geologist and popular science writer Ken Feder has made a similar argument, noting that the Atlantis story serves Plato's philosophical purposes so perfectly that positing a historical basis is both unnecessary and unsupported by evidence. Feder has also pointed out the logical problem with the kernel of truth approach, the idea that Plato's story is based on a real event, but that the details have been exaggerated or distorted. If we are free to change the location, the date, the size, and every other specific detail of Plato's account in order to make it fit a proposed location, then we are no longer testing Plato's story, we are creating our own. These are strong arguments, and they should give pause to anyone inclined to accept the reality of Atlantis uncritically. The burden of proof lies with those who claim that a civilization existed, not with those who deny it, and that burden has not been met. But the skeptic's case, while strong, is not without its own limitations. The argument from absence, we haven't found it, therefore it doesn't exist, is logically valid only up to a point. We have not searched the entire ocean floor. We have not excavated every promising site. We have not fully explored the vast areas of continental shelf that were above water during the Ice Age and are now submerged. The absence of evidence, as the saying goes, is not evidence of absence, particularly when the search has been limited by the immense practical challenges of underwater and deep-time archaeology. Furthermore, the skeptic's emphasis on Plato's philosophical purposes does not necessarily exclude a historical basis. A story can be both philosophically motivated and historically inspired. Plato may have taken a genuine tradition, perhaps a garbled Egyptian record of a real catastrophe, and reshaped it to serve his philosophical argument. The fact that the story works as philosophy does not prove that it was invented as philosophy. The debate, in the end, is not between certainty and uncertainty. Both sides are dealing with incomplete evidence and imperfect knowledge. The question is not whether Atlantis has been proven to exist, it has not, but whether the evidence justifies continued investigation. And on that question, reasonable people can disagree. Chapter 24, The Composite Theory, Many Atlantises, one of the most thoughtful approaches to the Atlantis mystery in recent years, has been the proposal that Atlantis is not a single place but a composite, a legendary construct that blends memories of multiple real events, places, and civilizations into a single, unified narrative. This idea is not new. It has been suggested in various forms by numerous researchers, but it has gained increasing sophistication and plausibility as our understanding of ancient cultural transmission has deepened. The composite theory proposes that the Atlantis account as recorded by Plato draws on several distinct sources, which were combined and elaborated over the centuries of transmission from Egypt to Greece. These sources might include genuine memories of the eruption of Thera and the collapse of the Minoan civilization, Egyptian records of invasions by the Sea Peoples, a mysterious confederation of maritime warriors who attacked Egypt and other eastern Mediterranean states around 1200 BCE, Greek geographical knowledge of the western Mediterranean, including Tartessos and the Pillars of Heracles, and universal flood myths reflecting the post-glacial sea level rise. Under this interpretation, there is no single real Atlantis to be found. Instead, the story is a palimpsest, a layered document in which multiple historical memories are written one on top of another, blended and distorted until the original elements are almost impossible to separate. The Sea People's connection is particularly intriguing. Around 1200 BCE, the great civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean, the Hittite Empire, Mycenaean Greece, the Kassite dynasty of Babylon, and others, collapsed in a cascade of destruction that historians call the Late Bronze Age collapse. The causes of this collapse are debated, but one factor appears to have been a series of devastating attacks by the Sea People's naval raiders, whose origins remain one of the great mysteries of ancient history. Egyptian records describe the Sea Peoples in vivid detail. The Temple of Medinet Habu, built by Ramesses III, contains extensive reliefs and inscriptions describing a great naval battle against the Sea Peoples around 1178 BCE. The inscriptions describe the invaders as coming from islands in the midst of the sea, and as having overwhelmed or destroyed multiple kingdoms before being defeated by Egypt. The parallels to Plato's Atlantis story are suggestive. A powerful naval force from Western islands attacks the Eastern Mediterranean, conquers multiple kingdoms, and is finally defeated by a single Eastern power. In Plato's version, the attackers are the Atlanteans and the defenders are the Athenians. In the Egyptian records, the attackers are the Sea Peoples and the defenders are the Egyptians. If Egyptian priests had preserved records of the Sea People's invasion, and we know they did because those records survive to this day at Medinet Habu, it is conceivable that these records were among the sources that Solon heard during his visit to Egypt. Over the centuries of transmission, the Egyptian victory might have been recast as an Athenian victory, and the Sea Peoples might have been conflated with earlier legends of a great western island, producing the composite narrative that Plato recorded. The composite theory is attractive because it does not require us to identify a single location that matches every detail of Plato's description, a task that has proved impossible for over 2 millennia. Instead, it acknowledges the complexity of cultural transmission and the natural tendency of stories to grow, merge, and transform as they pass from one culture to another, from one language to another, from one century to another. But the composite theory also has a weakness. It is almost impossible to prove or disprove. If Atlantis is a blend of multiple sources, then virtually any historical event, any archaeological discovery, any cultural parallel can be claimed as one of the ingredients of the composite. The theory becomes so flexible that it can accommodate almost any evidence, which means it is no longer a testable hypothesis but a framework for interpretation. This does not make it wrong. It may well be the closest we can come to the truth, but it should be held lightly as a possibility rather than a conclusion. Chapter 25, The Technology Question, How Advanced Were the Ancients? Central to many Atlantis theories is the claim that the Atlanteans possessed technology far beyond what is conventionally attributed to ancient civilizations. Plato describes a level of engineering, the canal systems, the hot and cold springs, the harbors, the bridges, the tunnels for triremes that is impressive by any standard. And many Atlantis enthusiasts have extrapolated from Plato's account to claim that the Atlanteans possessed technologies that rival or exceed our own, including energy generation from crystals, flying machines, and advanced metallurgy. These extreme claims are not supported by Plato's text or by any credible evidence. But the broader question of how technologically capable ancient civilizations were is a legitimate and important one. In recent years, a growing body of evidence has suggested that ancient peoples possessed more sophisticated technical knowledge than was previously believed. The Antikythera mechanism, discovered in 1901 in a Roman-era shipwreck off the coast of the Greek island of Antikythera, is perhaps the most dramatic example. This bronze device, dating to approximately 150 to 100 BCE, is an extraordinarily complex mechanical calculator, a kind of analog computer that was used to predict astronomical events, including eclipses, the positions of the sun and moon, and possibly the positions of the 5 planets known to the ancient Greeks. The Antikythera mechanism contains over 30 interlocking bronze gears of a sophistication that was not matched in Europe until the development of mechanical clocks in the 14th century CE, over 1,000 years later. Its existence proves that the ancient Greeks possessed a level of mechanical engineering that was previously unsuspected and that was subsequently lost for centuries. The Baghdad battery, a set of clay jars containing copper cylinders and iron rods, found near Baghdad and dating to the Parthian or Sassanid period, roughly 250 BCE to 650 CE, has been interpreted by some researchers as an early electrochemical cell, capable of producing a small electrical current. If this interpretation is correct, and it is disputed, it would suggest that ancient peoples discovered the principle of electrochemistry thousands of years before its modern rediscovery by Alessandro Volta in 1800. Ancient Roman concrete, opus cementitium, has been shown by modern analysis to be more durable than modern Portland cement in some applications. Roman harbor structures built with concrete over 2,000 years ago are still standing, while modern concrete structures often deteriorate within decades. The Roman secret was the use of volcanic ash, pozzolana, which, when combined with seawater, created a chemical reaction that actually strengthened the concrete over time. This knowledge was lost after the fall of the Roman Empire and has only recently been rediscovered by modern materials scientists. The ancient Egyptians' ability to quarry, transport, and precisely place massive stone blocks, as demonstrated at Giza, Luxor, Abu Simbel, and countless other sites, required sophisticated knowledge of engineering, mathematics, surveying, and project management. While we do not fully understand all the techniques they used, it is clear that their methods were effective, efficient, and based on accumulated knowledge developed over centuries. The ancient Indians developed advanced metallurgy, including the production of wootz steel, a crucible steel known for its exceptional hardness and its characteristic watered pattern, which was used to make the legendary Damascus swords. The techniques for producing wootz steel were developed in India as early as 300 BCE and were not replicated by European metallurgists until the modern era. These examples and many others could be cited to demonstrate that ancient civilizations possessed technical capabilities that are often underestimated. They do not prove the existence of Atlantis or of a lost super-civilization, but they do challenge the assumption that technological progress is a simple, linear, ever-upward progression, and they remind us that knowledge can be lost as well as gained. Civilizations can and do collapse, technologies can and do disappear. The knowledge and skills of one era are not automatically transmitted to the next. The fall of Rome was followed by centuries of reduced technical capability in much of Western Europe. The great engineering achievements of the Inca were disrupted and largely lost after the Spanish conquest. The sophisticated navigation techniques of the Polynesian voyagers were nearly forgotten as traditional voyaging declined under the influence of European colonization. If a major civilization had been destroyed by a natural catastrophe 12,000 years ago, as the Atlantis legend suggests, it is at least conceivable that its technical knowledge would have been largely lost, surviving only in fragments, in traditions, in myths, and in the skills of a few scattered survivors. This is a possibility, not a proof, but it is a possibility that should not be dismissed without serious consideration. Chapter 26, Astronomy and Alignment. The Sky as Witness. One of the most intriguing aspects of the search for lost civilizations is the role of astronomy. Ancient peoples around the world appear to have been deeply interested in the movements of the stars, the sun, and the moon, and many of their greatest monuments are aligned with celestial events in ways that demonstrate sophisticated astronomical knowledge. We have already discussed the alignment of Stonehenge with the solstices and the proposed alignment of the Giza pyramids with the belt of Orion, but these are just two examples among many. The Temple of Angkor Wat in Cambodia, the largest religious monument in the world, is aligned with extraordinary precision to the spring equinox. On the morning of the equinox, the sun rises directly over the central tower of the temple, creating a visual effect of remarkable beauty and symbolic power. The entire Angkor complex has been shown to mirror the constellation Draco as it appeared in the sky around 10,500 BCE, though this claim, like the Orion correlation theory, is disputed. The Mayan observatory at Chichen Itza, the circular structure known as El Caracol, was designed to track the movements of Venus, which played a crucial role in Mayan cosmology and calendar systems. The Mayan calendar itself was based on extraordinarily precise astronomical observations, tracking cycles of Venus, Mars, and other celestial bodies with an accuracy that was not surpassed in Europe until the modern era. The Nabta stone circle in the Egyptian desert, dating to approximately 5000 BCE, is one of the oldest known astronomical alignments in the world. The stones are arranged to track the summer solstice and the rising positions of certain stars, suggesting that the inhabitants of this region possessed sophisticated astronomical knowledge at a very early date. The Goseck Circle in Germany, a Neolithic enclosure dating to approximately 4900 BCE, is another early astronomical observatory, with gaps in its walls aligned with the sunrise and sunset positions on the winter solstice. The consistency of astronomical alignments in ancient monuments across different cultures and time periods has led some researchers to propose that a common body of astronomical knowledge was transmitted from a single ancient source, perhaps the lost civilization of Atlantis, to cultures around the world. This hypothesis is difficult to evaluate. On the one hand, astronomical observation is a natural human activity. The movements of the sun, moon, and stars are visible to everyone, and any culture with a need to track seasons for agricultural or ceremonial purposes would naturally develop knowledge of the sky. The fact that different cultures built astronomically aligned monuments does not necessarily imply a common source. On the other hand, the sophistication and precision of some ancient astronomical alignments and their appearance in contexts that seem too early for the level of social complexity required to build them, do raise legitimate questions about the origins of astronomical knowledge. The precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that causes the positions of the stars relative to the equinoxes to shift over a cycle of approximately 25,920 years, is particularly interesting in this context. Knowledge of precession requires centuries of careful astronomical observation and record-keeping, since the changes are too slow to be noticed within a single lifetime. The Greek astronomer Hipparchus is conventionally credited with discovering precession around 130 BCE, but some researchers have argued that knowledge of precession is encoded in the myths and monuments of much earlier civilizations. Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von Dechend, in their groundbreaking 1969 book Hamlet's Mill, argued that many ancient myths contain numerical references and symbolic structures that encode precessional data, suggesting that knowledge of precession was possessed by cultures thousands of years before Hipparchus. If this is correct and the thesis of Hamlet's Mill remains controversial, it would imply a tradition of astronomical knowledge stretching back to the remote past, possibly to the very era of the supposed lost civilization. Again, this does not prove the existence of Atlantis. But it suggests that the history of human intellectual achievement is longer, deeper, and more complex than the standard narrative allows, and that the sky, if we know how to read it, may preserve records of knowledge that has been lost on Earth. Chapter 27, What if Atlantis is found? Let us pause from the evidence and the arguments and ask a question that is seldom addressed in discussions of Atlantis. What would it actually mean if the lost civilization were found? Suppose that tomorrow a team of underwater archaeologists discovers, on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean or beneath the sands of the Sahara or in the shallow waters off some unexpected coast, the unmistakable remains of a large, sophisticated, previously unknown civilization. Suppose they find walls, buildings, roads, artifacts, inscriptions, the full material signature of a complex urban society dating to 10 or 12,000 years ago. What would be the consequences? First and most obviously, it would revolutionize our understanding of human history. The conventional timeline of civilization, which places the earliest complex societies in Mesopotamia and Egypt around 3500 to 3000 BCE, would have to be radically revised. Thousands of textbooks would become obsolete overnight. The entire framework of archaeology, anthropology, and ancient history would need to be rebuilt. This is not an exaggeration. The discovery of a 12,000-year-old civilization with urban centers, monumental architecture, and sophisticated technology would be, without question, the most important archaeological discovery in history. It would be the equivalent in the field of archaeology of the discovery of relativity in physics or the discovery of DNA in biology, a paradigm shift of the highest order. Second, it would raise profound questions about human potential. If our ancestors were capable of building a sophisticated civilization 12,000 years ago, and if that civilization was destroyed by a natural catastrophe, then the story of human progress is not the simple, upward curve that we often assume. It is a story of rises and falls, of achievements lost and knowledge forgotten, of civilizations that flourished and then vanished, leaving nothing but legends. This would be both humbling and inspiring. Humbling because it would remind us that our own civilization is not immune to catastrophe, that the forces of nature are far more powerful than anything we have built, and that what has happened before can happen again. Inspiring because it would demonstrate the extraordinary resilience and creativity of the human spirit, the ability to rebuild, to rediscover, to rise again from the ashes of destruction. Third, it would transform our understanding of the relationship between different ancient civilizations. If a parent civilization once existed that influenced the development of multiple later cultures, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Mesoamerican, and others, then the apparent similarities between these cultures would take on new significance. The parallels that Donnelly and others have pointed to, the pyramids, the flood myths, the astronomical knowledge, would no longer need to be explained by coincidence or independent invention. They would be evidence of a shared heritage, but this third point carries a danger. The idea of a single parent civilization that seeded all others can easily slide into cultural elitism, racial hierarchy, and the denial of indigenous achievement. It is essential to recognize that even if a lost civilization did exist, the cultures that came after it were not mere copies or descendants. They were creative, innovative, and original in their own right. The Egyptians, the Maya, the Chinese, the people of the Indus Valley, all these civilizations developed their own unique traditions, technologies, and worldviews, drawing on their own genius and their own particular circumstances. Fourth, the discovery of Atlantis would raise urgent questions about our own vulnerability. If a great civilization was destroyed by a cosmic impact, a volcanic eruption, a mega tsunami, or a rapid climate change 12,000 years ago, what is to prevent a similar catastrophe from destroying our civilization today? The answer, of course, is nothing. The Earth remains a geologically and cosmically active planet. Supervolcanoes, asteroid impacts, mega-earthquakes, and rapid climate shifts are all real possibilities. The difference between us and the Atlanteans, if they existed, is that we have the knowledge and the technology to detect, prepare for, and potentially prevent some of these threats. Whether we have the wisdom and the will to do so is another question. The discovery of Atlantis, in other words, would not just be a matter of historical curiosity. It would be a warning, a message from the deep past about the fragility of civilization and the importance of vigilance, preparation, and humility in the face of forces far greater than ourselves. Chapter 28, The Ocean Floor, the Last Frontier. As our technologies advance, the exploration of the ocean floor becomes ever more feasible and ever more tantalizing. The oceans cover approximately 71% of the Earth's surface. They contain an estimated 361 million square kilometers of seabed, an area larger than all the land on Earth combined. And despite decades of exploration, the vast majority of this seabed remains unmapped in detail, unexplored, and unknown. It has often been noted that we know more about the surface of Mars than about the floor of our own oceans. This is not an exaggeration. High-resolution satellite imagery has mapped the Martian surface to a resolution of a few meters per pixel. But our best global maps of the ocean floor, derived primarily from satellite altimetry, have a resolution of only about 5 kilometers per pixel, 1,000 times less detailed. There are vast areas of the ocean floor that have never been examined by sonar, photographed by camera, or visited by any submersible or remotely operated vehicle. The deep ocean below 2,000 meters is a world of perpetual darkness, crushing pressure, and near-freezing temperatures. It is, in the most literal sense, terra incognita, unknown territory. Could the remains of Atlantis lie in these unexplored depths? The practical challenges are enormous. Underwater archaeological excavation is far more difficult, expensive, and time-consuming than land-based excavation. Visibility is limited. Currents can shift sediments and obscure structures. Marine organisms colonize and degrade exposed surfaces, and the sheer scale of the ocean floor makes systematic searching impractical with current technology. But technology is advancing rapidly. Autonomous underwater vehicles, unmanned submersibles capable of exploring the ocean floor independently, are becoming increasingly sophisticated. Side-scan sonar, multi-beam bathymetry, and sub-bottom profiling can map the seabed in unprecedented detail. LiDAR technology, already used to detect buried structures on land, is being adapted for underwater use. Satellite-based remote sensing is improving in resolution and coverage. In the coming decades, it is likely that our knowledge of the ocean floor will expand dramatically. Vast areas that are currently unknown will be mapped, surveyed, and explored. And when they are, we may find things that we did not expect, not necessarily Atlantis as Plato described it, but perhaps remnants of human habitation from periods when sea levels were lower and the continental shelves were dry land. We already know that the continental shelves, the shallow underwater extensions of the continents, were exposed during the Ice Age. Coastlines were miles farther out than they are today. River valleys extended across what is now the seabed. And humans lived on these lands. They fished, hunted, gathered, and in some cases built structures that are now underwater. The flooded landscapes of the Dogger Bank in the North Sea, the submerged settlements off the coast of India, the underwater caves of the Yucatan Peninsula, all these provide tantalizing hints of a vast, hidden chapter of human history that lies beneath the waves. Whether this hidden chapter includes anything resembling Atlantis remains to be seen. But the ocean floor is the last great frontier of archaeological exploration, and it may hold surprises that no one has imagined. Chapter 29, The Human Need for Atlantis. Throughout this documentary, we have examined the Atlantis mystery from many angles: historical, geological, archaeological, cultural, and scientific. We have weighed the evidence, considered the theories, and heard from both advocates and skeptics. But there is one more dimension to the mystery that deserves our attention, a dimension that is not scientific but psychological. It is the question of why we care. Why does the legend of Atlantis grip the human imagination so powerfully? Why has it endured for 23 centuries, outlasting empires, religions, and entire civilizations? Why does it continue to inspire books, films, expeditions, and passionate debates in an age of satellites, computers, and genome sequencing? The answer, we believe, lies not in the evidence for or against Atlantis, but in something much deeper, something fundamental to the human condition. Human beings are storytelling creatures. We make sense of the world through narratives, stories that organize the chaos of experience into meaningful patterns. And among the most powerful of all narrative patterns is the pattern of the lost paradise, the golden age that existed before the fall, the perfect world that was destroyed by catastrophe or corruption, and the longing to recover what was lost. This pattern appears in virtually every culture on Earth. The Garden of Eden, the dreaming of the Aboriginal Australians, the four ages of Hindu mythology, the golden age of Hesiod, the Norse tales of Ragnarök and the world that was. In each case, the story tells of a time when the world was better, more harmonious, more magical, and of the catastrophe that brought that time to an end. Atlantis fits this pattern perfectly. It is the golden age made concrete, a specific place, a specific people, a specific civilization of extraordinary beauty and wisdom, brought low by its own hubris and destroyed by the wrath of the gods. It is the lost paradise with an address, a floor plan, and a body count. And this is why, for many people, the question of whether Atlantis was real is almost beside the point. The legend resonates because it speaks to a universal human experience, the experience of loss. Every individual knows what it is to lose something precious. Every generation knows what it is to look back on a better time that has passed. Every civilization carries within it the awareness that it too will one day fall. Atlantis gives this awareness a name, a shape, and a story. It is the myth of the might have been, the civilization that could have endured if only its people had remained virtuous. It is the warning that power without wisdom is self-destructive, and that the greatest civilizations are not those that build the tallest towers, but those that maintain the deepest integrity. In this sense, Atlantis is not just a historical mystery. It is a psychological necessity, a story that the human mind needs in order to make sense of the terrifying reality that nothing lasts forever. And perhaps that is the deepest reason why the search for Atlantis will never end. Even if the physical city is never found, even if every theory is disproved and every candidate location is ruled out, the legend will endure because it serves a purpose that transcends the merely factual. It reminds us who we are, what we value, and what we stand to lose. Chapter 30, LESSONS From the Deep. What then can we learn from the Atlantis mystery? After our long journey through the evidence, the theories, and the debates, what conclusions can we draw? First, we can say with confidence that the question of Atlantis is not settled. Despite the confident assertions of both believers and skeptics, the evidence does not permit a definitive conclusion. We cannot prove that Atlantis existed, and we cannot prove that it did not. The mystery remains open. Second, we can say that the search for Atlantis has been enormously productive, regardless of whether the lost city is ever found. The quest for Atlantis has driven exploration of the ocean floor, advanced the science of underwater archaeology, inspired groundbreaking research in geology and climatology, and forced scholars to reconsider long-held assumptions about the timeline of human civilization. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe, the investigation of the younger Dryas, the exploration of submerged landscapes on the continental shelves, all of these advances have been motivated, at least in part, by the persistent human desire to find what has been lost. Third, we can say that the Atlantis story, whether historical or fictional, contains wisdom that is relevant to every age. Plato's account of a civilization corrupted by wealth and power, punished by the gods for its arrogance, and destroyed by forces beyond human control is not merely an ancient curiosity. It is a meditation on the nature of civilization itself, on the conditions that allow societies to flourish and the forces that bring them down. In our own time, we face challenges that would have been familiar to Plato, the challenge of maintaining virtue in the face of prosperity, the challenge of using power wisely, the challenge of balancing material progress with moral integrity. We face environmental threats, climate change, biodiversity loss, resource depletion, that could, if left unchecked, lead to the kind of catastrophic disruption that the Atlantis legend describes. And we face the ever-present risk of natural disasters, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, pandemics that could strike at any time, with or without warning. The lesson of Atlantis is not that catastrophe is inevitable. It is that catastrophe is possible and that the best defense against it is not walls or weapons or wealth, but the qualities of character that Plato valued above all else: wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice. Fourth, we can say that the mystery of Atlantis is part of a larger mystery, the mystery of who we are and where we came from. The story of human civilization is far longer, far more complex, and far less fully understood than the textbooks suggest. We are only beginning to grasp the depth of our own past. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe in the 1990s pushed back the date of monumental construction by thousands of years. Future discoveries may push it back further still. The ocean floor, the desert sands, the ice sheets, the jungles, all these environments conceal secrets that we have not yet uncovered. The story of humanity is still being written, and the chapters that lie hidden beneath the earth and beneath the waves may turn out to be the most extraordinary of all. Chapter 31, The Philosophers and the Flood. Let us return one final time to Plato. We have spent our entire journey debating whether Plato was telling the truth about Atlantis, whether he was recording a genuine historical tradition or inventing a philosophical fable. But perhaps we have been asking the wrong question. Perhaps the more important question is not whether Plato was telling the truth, but what truth he was telling. Consider the structure of the Atlantis narrative. It is a story about two civilizations, Athens and Atlantis, that represent two fundamentally different approaches to life. Athens, in Plato's telling, is the ideal state, small, virtuous, governed by philosopher warriors who live simply and value justice above all else. Atlantis is the anti-ideal, vast, wealthy, powerful, governed by kings who once were virtuous but have been corrupted by their own success. The conflict between them is not just a military conflict. It is a moral conflict, a contest between two visions of what civilization should be. And the outcome, Athens's victory, followed by the destruction of both civilizations, carries a profound and unsettling message. Plato is telling us that the virtuous society can defeat the corrupt one, that moral strength can overcome material power. But he is also telling us that even the virtuous society is not immune to destruction. The same catastrophe that sinks Atlantis also swallows Athens. Both are wiped from the earth, both are forgotten. Only the distant records of Egypt, a civilization that endures precisely because of its geographical isolation and its institutional conservatism, preserve their memory. This is not a comforting message. It is, in fact, deeply disturbing. It suggests that the cosmos does not reward virtue with survival, that even the best society can be destroyed by forces beyond its control. It suggests that the purpose of virtue is not to guarantee permanence, but to give meaning to the fleeting moment of existence. It suggests that civilizations, like individuals, must find their worth not in how long they last, but in how they live. These ideas resonate across the centuries because they are timelessly true. Every civilization faces the same fundamental challenge: how to live well in the knowledge that everything must pass. And every civilization finds its own answers in religion, in philosophy, in art, in law, in the bonds of community and family. The Atlantis story, read in this light, is not just a mystery to be solved. It is a mirror to be gazed into, a mirror that reflects the deepest truths about the human condition. And the image in that mirror is not of a lost city beneath the sea, but of ourselves. Chapter 32, Echoes in the Modern World. The echoes of Atlantis reverberate through our modern world in ways both obvious and subtle. The legend has become embedded in our culture so deeply that its influence is felt even by those who have never read a word of Plato. The very concept of a lost civilization, the idea that a great society can vanish without a trace, leaving only legends and ruins, is largely a product of the Atlantis tradition. Before Plato, the ancient world did not have a fully developed concept of civilizational collapse and erasure. After Plato, the idea became commonplace, and it has shaped the way we think about history, archaeology, and our own future ever since. The environmental movement of the late 20th and early 21st centuries has drawn heavily, if often unconsciously, on Atlantean imagery. The idea that a civilization can be destroyed by its own excesses, that unchecked growth, resource exploitation, and environmental degradation can lead to catastrophic collapse, is essentially the Atlantis narrative applied to the modern world. When climate scientists warn that our current trajectory is unsustainable, they are telling a story that Plato would recognize. The science fiction genre owes an enormous debt to Atlantis. The concept of a technologically advanced civilization that existed in the remote past, whether on Earth or on another planet, and was destroyed by catastrophe, is a staple of science fiction literature, film, and television. From H.G. Wells to Arthur C. Clarke, from Star Trek to Stargate, the lost civilization trope has provided the framework for countless stories about humanity's origins, its potential, and its vulnerability. Even the field of archaeology itself has been shaped by the Atlantis tradition. The romantic image of the intrepid explorer venturing into unknown territory in search of lost cities, an image that owes as much to the legend of Atlantis as to real archaeological practice, has inspired generations of archaeologists, from Schliemann at Troy to Howard Carter in the Valley of the Kings, to the underwater explorers searching for sunken cities on the ocean floor. And on a more personal level, the legend of Atlantis speaks to a longing that resides in the heart of every human being, the longing for a world that is better than this one. A world where wisdom and virtue prevail over greed and corruption. A world where the beauty of nature and the creativity of the human spirit are allowed to flourish without the shadow of destruction hanging over them. A world that may never have existed, but that we can imagine and that we can strive to create. This is perhaps the ultimate gift of the Atlantis legend, not a location on a map, not a ruin on the ocean floor, but a vision, a shining, impossible, heartbreaking vision of what civilization could be at its best. A vision that challenges us to ask whether we are living up to our potential, or whether we are, like the later Atlanteans, squandering our inheritance and courting our own destruction. Chapter 33, The Searchers. Throughout this documentary, we have focused primarily on the evidence and the theories. But behind every theory stands a person, a searcher, a dreamer, a questioner who has devoted their time, energy, and sometimes their entire life to the pursuit of a mystery that may never be solved. These people deserve to be acknowledged because the search for Atlantis is ultimately a human story, a story of passion, obsession, disappointment, and hope. There is Ignatius Donnelly, the self-taught polymath who single-handedly launched the modern Atlantis debate and whose sweeping vision, despite its many flaws, opened the door to a conversation that continues to this day. There is Spiridon Marinatos, the Greek archaeologist who connected the eruption of Thera to the collapse of the Minoan civilization and who died in 1974 at his excavation site at Akrotiri, crushed by a falling wall, a martyr, in a sense, to the search for the truth behind the legend. There is Jacques Cousteau, the legendary French oceanographer who explored the waters around Crete and Thera in the 1970s, searching for evidence of the Minoan-Atlantis connection and bringing the mystery to millions of television viewers around the world. There is Robert Sarmast, who in 2004 announced that he had found Atlantis on the seabed between Cyprus and Syria, based on sonar data that appeared to show man-made structures on the Mediterranean floor. His claim was subsequently challenged, and the evidence remains inconclusive. There is Paulina Zalitsky, a Russian-Canadian ocean engineer who in 2001 reported finding what appeared to be a submerged city off the coast of western Cuba at a depth of over 600 meters. Sonar images showed what appeared to be geometric shapes, pyramids, roads, and buildings, covering an area of roughly 2 square kilometers. The discovery generated enormous excitement, but subsequent investigation was limited by the extreme depth and the difficulty of operating in Cuban waters, and the site has never been conclusively identified as an archaeological site. There is Richard Freund, the archaeologist who investigated the Doñana Marshes in southern Spain and argued that the buried structures he found were the remains of a great city that matched Plato's description of Atlantis. There are the countless amateur researchers, independent scholars, weekend divers, and passionate enthusiasts who have scoured the globe, often at their own expense, often in the face of professional ridicule, in search of the lost city. Some of their claims have been extravagant, some have been irresponsible, but many have been driven by a genuine and admirable curiosity, a refusal to accept that the question is closed, a determination to keep looking, keep questioning, keep searching. The search for Atlantis has not always been conducted with scientific rigor. It has sometimes been marred by pseudoscience, wishful thinking, and outright fraud. But at its best, it represents something noble, the human refusal to accept the limits of the known, the insistence that there is always more to discover, and the faith that the past holds secrets that are worth uncovering. These searchers, whatever their faults, are part of a tradition that stretches back to Plato himself, the tradition of asking questions that may not have answers, and of believing that the asking itself has value. Chapter 34, The Future of the Search, What Lies Ahead for the Search for Atlantis. In all likelihood, the search will continue for as long as human beings are curious about their past. New technologies will open new avenues of investigation. New discoveries in archaeology, geology, climatology, and genetics will provide new evidence to evaluate, and new generations of researchers will bring fresh perspectives, fresh questions, and fresh enthusiasm to the mystery. Several developments could prove particularly significant in the coming years. The ongoing mapping of the ocean floor, using increasingly sophisticated sonar, satellite, and autonomous underwater vehicle technologies, will provide unprecedented views of the submerged landscape. If large-scale archaeological remains exist on the continental shelves or the ocean floor, these technologies will eventually reveal them. Advances in genetic analysis, particularly the ability to extract and sequence ancient DNA from human remains, soil samples, and even sediment cores, could shed light on population movements, cultural connections, and possible lost populations in the deep past. If a significant population existed on a now submerged landmass, traces of their genetic legacy might be detectable in the DNA of modern populations. The continued investigation of the younger Dryas impact hypothesis will determine whether a cosmic impact triggered the climatic and ecological changes that occurred 12,800 years ago. If the impact hypothesis is confirmed, it will provide a credible mechanism for the destruction of a coastal civilization during the relevant time period. Archaeological research at key sites, including Göbekli Tepe, the Richat structure, the Doñana Marshes, and various underwater locations, will continue to refine our understanding of the deep past and may produce discoveries that change the terms of the debate. And the broader revolution in our understanding of human prehistory, driven by new methods, new data, and a growing willingness to question established assumptions, will continue to challenge the conventional timeline of civilization and to open space for the possibility that important chapters of the human story remain to be discovered. Whether any of these developments will ultimately vindicate the legend of Atlantis, whether the lost city will ever be found, is impossible to predict. Skeptics may be right. Atlantis may be nothing more than a philosopher's invention, a brilliant, beautiful, unforgettable fiction that has outlived its creator by over 2 millennia. Or the believers may be right. Somewhere beneath the sand or the sea, the remains of a great civilization may lie waiting, buried, forgotten, but not entirely gone. Waiting for the moment when the right technology, the right insight, the right stroke of fortune will bring it back into the light. We do not know. We may never know. But we will keep searching. Chapter 35, a final word, and so our journey comes to an end. We have traveled across 23 centuries of human thought, from the philosophical gardens of ancient Athens to the laboratories of modern science. We have followed the legend of Atlantis through empires and revolutions, through periods of blind faith and fierce skepticism, through the age of exploration and the age of technology. We have examined the evidence with as much rigor and fairness as we can muster, and we have allowed the mystery to speak for itself. We began with a question: was Atlantis real? We end with an answer that is not an answer. We do not know. But the question matters because the search for Atlantis is more than a search for a lost city. It is a search for the truth about our own past and for the wisdom to face our own future. Plato told us the story of a civilization that had everything: wealth, power, knowledge, beauty, and lost it all because it lost the one thing that mattered most, its virtue. Its people became blind to the difference between true greatness and mere grandeur. They mistook their wealth for their worth. They confused their power with their purpose. And when the judgment came, as in Plato's telling it always does, they had nothing left to save them. This is not just a story about the past. It is a story about the present and the future. Every generation faces the same temptation. Every civilization stands at the same crossroads. The choice between wisdom and folly, between virtue and corruption, between the enduring and the ephemeral, this choice is not historical. It is eternal. Atlantis, whether it lies beneath the waves of the Atlantic, under the sands of the Sahara, in the volcanic caldera of Santorini, or only in the timeless pages of Plato's dialogues, carries a message that transcends its own mystery. It is a message about the fragility of everything we build, the importance of everything we value, and the consequence of everything we choose. The great city may have sunk beneath the sea. The golden temples may have crumbled. The 10 kings may have been forgotten. But the story endures, the warning endures, the question endures, and so does the search. For somewhere in the depths of the ocean of history of the human heart, Atlantis waits. Not to be found, perhaps, but to be understood. Not to be recovered, but to be remembered. Not as a place on a map, but as an idea in the mind, the idea that civilization, at its best, is a gift of the gods, and that the preservation of that gift depends not on walls of brass or temples of gold, but on the simple, difficult, endlessly demanding practice of being worthy of what we have been given. This has been Atlantis, the mysterious hidden world. The mystery endures, the search continues. And the story, the oldest, deepest, most haunting story of them all, goes on. Thank you for watching.